Here we go. It's all yours.
Uh-oh. Did we lose Drew?
I think we may have.
Well, I guess it's my turn to do this then.
Good morning.
Here. I kind of hear him, but his video is not moving either. You're seeing me, right? Okay. Okay. All right. Well, let's see if I can just steal the screen share from him. And I'll pretend to be Drew for a moment. I can never do as good a job of being Drew as Drew does himself, but I can pretend. Let me share my screen here. Well, it's good to be a part of the West Virginia GIS Virtual Conference. My name is Jeff Ledbetter. You'll see Drew's slide here in just a minute, but I am a public safety GIS expert here at the on the DataMark team, and I am coming to you from Bowling Green, Kentucky today. And I've been working in public safety and at the intersection of public safety and GIS for the last 12 years or so. I've been working with GIS in general since 1998, and glad to share some of our insights that we've culled together as a collective team of GIS and public safety professionals. And I see Drew's back. Some of the advance the slide and give him an opportunity to introduce himself.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. And I'll tell you, there's nothing that brings the fear of God into me more than being turned over to start a presentation and my internet cuts out.
Yeah, perfect time.
Facts. Love it. Great. It was perfect for the first 15 minutes we were on before anybody showed up. But we're going to keep this rolling. That's why we have two of us here. Technology is amazing. And we're going to show you some of the technology that's been advanced for public safety and GIS over the past several years. But let's get to me a little bit. So my name is Drew Fiorinelli. I'm one of the public safety GIS experts on the DataMark team, but I have a long history of working in local government. I've held titles as tech, analyst, director. If you can have a local government GIS position, I have been there and I have done it all. I've also had the pleasure of building a GIS program from the ground up for the city of Asheboro in North Carolina. A lot of people don't know where Asheboro, North Carolina is, but if you know where the zoo is, that is Asheboro. I'm also a former GIS director for Fauquier County. I'm the president of the Geospatial Information and Technology Association, and I'm a former volunteer firefighter. And that's really kind of where I really fell in love with public safety, was experiencing as a volunteer what our career public safety professionals go through every day. And I could really start to see the value of GIS and supporting that sector of people who put their lives on the line to protect us. You really start to understand how valuable location is, but from a different perspective. So that's why I really like this GIS Next Gen 911 conversation. So really happy to share that with you guys today. All right, but first I want to start with some references. So as you start digging into NG911, you're going to find that there's a lot of standards. There's a lot of informational documents. This isn't even all of them that I'm showing you, but these are some really important ones to start familiarizing yourself as you start having the NG911 conversation locally. We're going to talk specifically to 3 or 4 of these throughout the slide deck, but I linked all of these here for you guys. So if you want to copy the slide deck, let me know, so that you have quick access to these documents. And you'll notice down towards the bottom, we have some that are older and legacy related. So throughout the presentation, when we refer to legacy, we're referring to current state 911 or E911 or 911. So what was versus what's now versus what's coming. That makes a little bit of sense, but it's important to identify these documents because we're going to see that some stuff was migrated over from these legacy informational documents and somehow became adopted as standard or requirement for next gen. And so we're going to talk through that a little bit so that we provide a little bit of understanding and clarity to it. All right, now first, Jeff, I know you love this slide, but this is our GIS and NG911 quiz. Yes, we will be grading you on this. You're required to get 80% to pass this course. Really, we wanted to dispel some misnomers around NG911, and this is a great way to do it. And MSAG is an example of spatial data.
Hey, let's use the chat to give us a sense of your answers.
Yeah, oh, that's a great one.
False, right?
Absolutely.
MSAG is an example of spatial data. I personally love presenting these workshops to GIS focused groups because a lot of times we find that there are a lot of GIS folks, this is their first exposure to some of these public safety terms, and we do our best to translate those when we see it. But sometimes we miss. Like telling the distinction between legacy and next gen is a good example of that. And so we want you to engage today with the chat dialogue. If you come up with questions like that,
absolutely.
What do you mean by legacy? What is what, right? Whatever questions you might have. And then on these next 4 questions here, next 5 questions, we're going to need way more than 3 of you to answer. So
now, Jeff, it would probably do us well to identify what an MSAG is, right? I know we're speaking to a largely GIS group, where an MSAG can be somewhat of a GIS topic, but it really falls in the public safety space. So an MSAG is a master street address guide that's used in the public service answering point, PSAP, in the 911 call center. So now knowing what a PSAP is it an example of spatial data?
So
false.
Yeah, we say false, right? Because the fact is that the MSAG database itself is a database of street address ranges that connect to what's called an emergency service number, ESN, that helps the selective router in 911 in current state E911 route 911 calls. It's basically an Excel spreadsheet. So it does not have spatial data. It does not have a coordinate tied to it in any way. So we say false. Now, it is understandable how some people might say true, because there's been a lot of efforts over the last few years, particular, to begin thinking about how the MSAG should be represented in spatial data and connected to the many road centerline segments in your GIS database to the few larger address ranges with ESNs connected to them in the MSAG.
Hey, Jeff, we got a great question, and this really kind of helps make our point. So yeah, James, it's a database, but no location reference. Exactly.
Exactly right.
Exactly what the MSAG is.
Yeah, and so another term we're going to use throughout the day, and you guys will identify with this one, I think, quite easily, but is a civic address or a civic location, meaning, 123 Main Street. The MSAG is very much more concerned about 123 Main Street than it is a lat long or any other sort of spatial coordinate. So yeah, you nailed it there, James. The next question, the PSAP is responsible for provisioning the best GIS data. If any of you have worked with your PSAPs, your 911 call centers, the people who run the dispatch systems in those PSAPs, people who run the phone systems, you probably have realized that they don't know that much about GIS, much less what the difference between a map and data is, right? And so how could they be responsible for provisioning the best GIS data? Got a couple guesses at false. It's actually true.
I'm actually loving the question mark. False?
Yeah, false, I think. I'm going to take a guess at it. And by the way, that's okay, right? Take a guess at it. Actually, throwing a question mark behind it is a great way to say, I'm engaging you, but I don't really know.
Right.
And that's okay, because what we're here to do today is to educate, right? And to introduce everybody to these concepts. So we really appreciate your engaging us, even though you're not confident or you don't know. Sometimes there's no stupid questions, no dumb questions. Right now, there's no dumb answers. How about that?
Facts. But it's actually true. The PSAP is responsible for provisioning the best GIS data. So let's walk through that statement a little bit. When we talk about provisioning GIS data, that's the actual process of taking your local GIS data and putting it into the 911 environment to direct support 911 in an NG911 environment. Now, later on, we actually detail this out a lot more. So we're not going to go into much detail here, but think about that for a minute. As we move towards NG911, the PSAP or 911 call center is responsible for the accuracy of the GIS data being used to support 911.
And what you're thinking about as well is how big of a challenge is it for PSAPs, people who aren't GIS professionals, to even assess the quality and have trust so that they can trust it and know that it's worthy of provisioning into the 911 system when they don't have that expertise? Well, I mean, the short answer is they have to engage folks like yourselves who do have those expertise and they can trust, and they need to build those relationships sooner rather than later.
Right. And so we've got a question.
Hey, Drew.
Yeah. Hey, Kevin.
Sorry, I had trouble logging in this morning, so
That's okay.
that's terrible. So good morning. Sorry about that, to interrupt for starters. But hey, there's a couple questions about the PSAP. Can you define PSAP for everyone, for starters? And then actually, I have a follow-up question, which also is in West Virginia, there's a role of addressing coordinator. And that addressing coordinator is typically, I believe, responsible for creating and providing E911 addresses. Technically, if they don't work for the PSAP, wouldn't they be responsible then for providing the best data?
This is exactly why we raised this topic. It's an important one for GIS people to understand that you may or may not ever be engaged in this process. Now, the best practice is absolutely that you should be. The best practice is that you should build a relationship with your 911, and public safety partners in general, not just 911, but especially 911, so that everybody's using the same data and that it's being managed and maintained in a way that is appropriate for next generation 911 and use in the 911 system. But that doesn't always happen, right? Sometimes the PSAP says, you know what, I'm gonna contract with somebody, or I'm gonna hire my own, or I'm just gonna figure it out, right? Public safety has very much an assess, adapt, and overcome mentality that says, I'll just figure it out. And the data on my CAD map has been good for all these years. It's bound to be good for next gen 911 too. But as you engage with them, you can help them see what the distinction is and what the sort of plus up is that the GIS professional offers them, if that's a thing you want to do, which to me is a no-brainer. So a PSAP, to answer your question directly, and thank you, Richard, for putting it in the chat, public safety answering point is the 911 center. It's the place that the 911 calls go to be answered. We're going to talk a little bit, I think, in here about primary versus secondary, right, Drew?
Not necessarily. I don't think we have a slide for it, but it is something that we kind of talk to.
Okay, well, let me just elucidate it here then. The primary PSAP is where the 911 call goes to be answered straightway. Typically, that's going to be a law enforcement answering center. Sometimes law enforcement, fire, EMS is all coming out of the same dispatch center. Sometimes it's not. So if it's not, and there needs to be a transfer to a secondary PSAP, typically that is a fire or EMS, fire and EMS sometimes as well, PSAP or answering point that needs to be transferred to. So primary receives the call straightway, secondary receives a transfer of a 911 call and all the 911 data that goes with it.
Right.
So that makes more sense. Yeah, Richard, good comment. Helps to share GIS data with 911, floodplain management, the assessor's office, sheriff's office, etc. And what I love about that comment is that it really embraces the idea of master data management, right? MDM. There really should be in a GIS professional's vocabulary and conception this idea of master data management. Let's build it one time and use it many different ways and integrate it across the enterprise so that it not only helps 911, but it helps floodplain management. It helps that address coordinator. It helps the permitting department. It helps the planning department. And it helps, things like transportation with asset management or pavement management systems. It helps the billing department, the financial department locate where their revenues and their costs and all those things are located at. You have opportunity as a GIS professional to really make your data the most valuable asset that the city, that the county, that the agency has. And so NextGen 911 is just a great way to demonstrate that data. It's the ROI case us GIS nerds have always been looking for. If you'll just sort of embrace it, understand it, and then go make that case to the people that it matters to, right? So this is a great discussion that we're having here.
Yeah. And Kevin, that's a great comment. You're right. Unfortunately, not all 911 addresses make it back into the assessor's office or to the municipal offices. As we get into the next gen conversation, you're going to see where that's going to flip some of that power back to you as the GIS professional, because you will have a larger role in how that happens and how that occurs and how the data is shared. You become a very integral piece to what goes on in public safety as it relates to data.
And then Frank, another good follow-up question, right? What is the role and problems presented by general IT interoperability issues with that? There's a ton of them, to be honest. Like you're calling out truth there. It's a concept that you should be like thinking about and how can we work towards, but there's going to be roadblocks in every one of those opportunities that you'll have to overcome. And in public safety, there's definitely going to be a separate mindset, right? Let's just prepare everybody for that too. There's definitely going to be a separate mindset that goes with that assess, adapt, and overcome mindset that says we have our own secure networks, we have our own secure this and that, and so you'll have to figure out. That's why I call it a partnership. You'll have to have plenty of conversations and partner with one another to figure out what's the right way for me to do I just need to throw the data over the brick wall? You're gonna like drill a hole in the brick wall for me to kind of pump it through? What's the best way for your particular agency and its setup, its networking requirements, its IT issues and all of that?
Yeah.
Could you use Arc Online REST service to feed the address to everyone? Now we're really thinking about it, right? I love that thought, and that's absolutely the right direction. A service-oriented architecture that we have available to us, whether you're talking about the Esri platform or any other open or other platforms, the things in this service-oriented architecture that we have options for today can actually solve these problems where maybe 10 years ago, we really had a bigger issue in just the ability to share data in a smooth and unhindered way. And I think you're absolutely thinking the right direction with that service-based thinking.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Richard, so notification is a huge part of it too. And that's the other thing. As GIS technologists, we tend to think that technology solves all the problems, but there has to be a business process to go along with all the data processes and the services and all of that. It's not just a technical problem. There's a business problem, a technical problem, and there's an architecture that needs to be thought about and put in place that rolls all of this, moves it forward, right? Steams the train forward.
Jeff, what's even better about Richard's comment is he's already identifying that there's a need to develop those internal partnerships to work interdepartmentally to accomplish the same goal, right? By setting up call sharing, by doing the notification systems, by being on the same page, that's going to benefit you moving into the NG911 world. It's going to also benefit you in ensuring that your data stays as current as possible.
Well, that's really what builds that ROI that we're talking about here, right?
Absolutely.
If you remain fragmented and you're still sending shapefiles across emails, I mean, that's going to be dubious, that return on investment, right? Like, oh, wow, this is great. Take me back to 1995. This is fantastic. We're really moving forward now. But in this, utilizing services and having well thought out business processes, notifications, and all those things, it just becomes really seamless as possible, right?
Mhm.
And the benefits and the return on investment becomes really clear. Now, convincing people to invest in it in the first place, you have to be thoughtful about how you engage and build those partnerships so that people are on board with it. But again,
That's the hard part.
you have a lever in NextGen 911 because it will be required at some point, whether it's by the state or your local PSAP or whomever, at some point it'll be required for them to have appropriate, locally based, maintained, authoritative GIS data for road center lines, address points, PSAP boundaries, and emergency service boundaries. And we'll talk about what those are as we go along as well. So this is a great conversation. I love the comments. Let's get into our third question because we're only in the introduction here. So,
Right.
but I want to engage in these conversations because even though we have a structure in a slideshow here, like these comments and conversations, and I appreciate Kevin. Feel free to speak up if you have something that's easier to say than type as well, because this is where the value is really at.
Well, that's the point of this, right? Our goal is to make sure that you show up with questions and that we address those questions so you don't leave having those same questions, because then we feel like we missed something there, right? As Jeff stated, while we do have slides to work through that's going to address some of this, it's the engagement here is the important piece, and it's what we're missing when we're not face to face. So let's try, and I want to continue to encourage that throughout.
Yeah, so our third question here is true or false, synchronizing GIS data with legacy 911 databases, that is the MSAG, the Master Street Address Guide we talked about before, and the Automatic Location Information Database, or ALI, to a 98% match rate constitutes NG911 data readiness. That was a long question to read.
That's it's a tough question for a lot of folks, because in the GIS world, when I was in local government, I don't know anything about this. I don't know about synchronizing GIS data to MSAG or ALI. I never had to do it.
I'm liking the answers that are coming in.
Yeah.
That's a false, right?
Yeah.
This is the reason we even bring this up, and we'll talk more in detail about it as we go through. But there became this perception in the 911 world, the NINA world, that because of an information document that was put out in 2009 that was really just geared at, with good intentions, geared at getting 911 people to realize that they need to start working on synchronizing their GIS data so that they can move forward into a next-gen system, kind of put like, hey, we got to put a target out there or we won't have anything to shoot at, right? And it said, we recommend something like 98%, but recognize that it's because we recognize that these are dynamic databases that are always changing and you may not ever get to 100%. And that turned into the gold coin, that if I can just grab that gold coin, I'm ready to go. Some states tied funding to it. PSAP folks that didn't really understand GIS, didn't really understand what it even meant to be 98% synchronized, would look to their GIS people and go, well, just snap your fingers and make it 98% and we're good to go, right? So we like to bring that up as an issue up front, give our perspective on it, which is that is not a gold coin. It's a useful first step, but it's not where you need to end up. Your work is not done once you get there, if you get there. And acknowledge the fact is that not everybody is going to even approach 98%. And there are good reasons why that may be okay. And it may be a problem, right? So we hope to arm you with the beginnings of the conversation to figure out if that's even something you need to desire to achieve or it's not.
Absolutely.
And James, great comment. Need more than 98%. Like if you have, whether you have a large jurisdiction or a small jurisdiction, that 2% that won't route because your GIS data doesn't connect with a record in the legacy system, you really need to get through, right? You need to resolve whether or not that's a problem that can be fixed or it's a problem that can't be fixed. Fix the things that can be fixed, note the things that can't, and then move forward into the next step. So let's look at our fourth question. For the PSAP, NG911 call routing is the sole need for high quality GIS data, true or false? And what I want you to think about while you're formulating your true or false answer is, do you think the value of GIS within the 911 call center and frankly, the first responder field that it serves, you think that's the only place where high quality GIS data is going to be useful for them?
Right. And specific to this statement, call routing is when I dial 911 and hit send, where does that call go? Right, Jeff?
Yeah. Yeah, and what are the other sort of what I refer to as downstream uses of this same data? We're going to talk about dispatching systems. False is the consistent answer we're getting, and I'm glad to see that. Right, there's value in your GIS data beyond just routing a phone call. The thing I hope you'll learn today is that in next generation 911, a machine-to-machine interface is going to use your GIS data. It's not even going to have a visualization in this routing components for 911 calls. So what are the things that could be added into the PSAP, the dispatch systems in place, again, for the call taker, for the dispatcher, and for the first responder in the field, that has visual elements that maps are so good at, that our GIS data is good at when it's put together well and presented appropriately, that can be used there as well. And we'll have some discussion around that. So the PSAP boundaries, next question, the PSAP boundaries sole purpose is to assist the ECRF, the emergency call routing function. And I'll just say here as I pause, I know we're asking some questions, assuming that you may know some things, but this is actually helping us gauge kind of the audience knowledge so that we can make sure that we don't spend a lot of time giving you basics if you don't need basics, but we do if you do need basics. But PSAP boundaries sole purpose is to assist the ECRF, the emergency call routing function, in routing 911 calls to the most appropriate primary PSAP. True or false? If we don't get a lot of answers, that's okay. We'll move on. We got a true out of that. Good.
Yeah.
And I totally agree. That PSAP boundary has not really ever existed before. Maybe it has. Some jurisdictions have visualized or spatialized their emergency service numbers for like cell sector routing decisions to be made by and things like that. So maybe that information existed kind of in that form, but it was really not a one-to-one before. But its sole purpose of this PSAP boundary is for answering the question, where do I send that 911 call? That's what the ECRF does. We'll talk about that in detail here shortly. And last question, does a transition to an EZNet or an emergency services IP network mean better responses? The next generation 911 in its end state doesn't happen without an EZNet. So it's a core piece of next gen 911 transition. So the question is, does a transition to this network mean better responses? I see some truths in there. I don't know if that was to this question, but we're gonna move with that because the answer is true.
It is true.
That because public safety 911 specifically now comes into 1995 with these IP-based networks, internet protocol-based networks, that we've all been using in office environments for years and years, but they've not been using to route 911 calls and to route 911 data across, all of a sudden opens up the world of 911 and the data that they can share to every device that is IP enabled and every type of data that can be collected and transmitted across an IP network. And so what that means is new technologies, new opportunities for better responses. And we'll talk about those in detail.
Absolutely. All right, so let's talk through the agenda a little bit. We're going to talk about some important facts. We're going to talk through current state, so how 911 is right now versus a future state, looking at what 911 looks like in the NG911 environment and how GIS really impacts that. We're going to talk through some of the core services, specifically the emergency call routing function and location validation function. We will talk through some standards. I showed you the reference slide earlier. We don't reference each of those standards, but there are some major ones that we do want to point out for you guys. Again, we're going to do a deeper dive into GIS in the NG911 world. Start looking at some best practices that you can start leveraging to get prepared for this. Different things to think about, some things you can start doing on your desktops, and some conversations you can start having. We're going to talk about the need to have an order in place. So you can't really just jump off the high dive into the pool that is NG911. We provide a methodology or so of how to think through this, what can be very overwhelming concept of GIS in NG911 and NG911 as it is. We're going to dive deeper into why you have to go beyond that 98% synchronization for accuracy that Jeff was talking through with our questions. And then we're going to look at some steps that you can take, things you can start doing now, conversations you can start having, and really understanding that this is not something that you're going to accomplish in a month. It may not be something you can accomplish in a year. So how can you think through the next 5 years when it relates to NG911?
Really get strategic about it.
Absolutely. All right, and then Jeff, the acronyms that we've already talked through, we've actually got a slide for it.
Almost hit all of these, but
we did. So we'll go through this real quick. The PSAP is the public safety answering point, or the 911 call center, as we've talked through. The EZNet, the emergency service IP network that Jeff just talked about with our question, that is the new infrastructure for 911 that moves away from the legacy or current copper lines that were really ways to connect your house and identify your house when you called 911 in a very flat document. The NGCS is the next generation core services. So we group those core services in, well, the core services are going to be your ECRF, your LVF, your LIS, and your SI. So all of that gets packaged into a group that's called your core services environment that is part of the new network. The emergency call routing function is one of the functions in the EZNet that identifies where to send your call, and it uses geospatial data. The location validation function is, again, one of those it pre-validates a location when you call 911 to determine where to send the call, right? Again, uses geospatial data. The MSAG and ALI we've already talked about. We'll go into deeper discussion here in a couple of slides. The LIS, or your location information server, Jeff, you've got to take that one. You know it better than me.
Yeah, it's more of a concept than an actual thing, but basically the service providers, the AT&Ts, the I don't know who the big internet company ISP is, right? Xfinity or Spectrum or whoever your cable provider is a good example of this as well. They are going to hold these list databases, and they're going to be their customer databases, right? So the customer database will be held in a list. It'll take the location data out of there, compare it to the location data in the LVF, and say, is this a valid location?
Right. And then our spatial interface, or our SI, is really one of the main core components of that core service environment. And your EZNet, that's where we're going to provision our GIS data to. So when I tell you to take your GIS data and put into the 911 environment, you shove it into the spatial interface. And then from there, it gets redistributed to these other functions that are in the EZNet. And we do have a diagram that shows all this, so it'll make more sense. And then NENA is the National Emergency Number Association. That's the standardizing body behind 911. So they're the ones that produce the standards, the informational documents and requirements for most things related to 911. More specifically for this conversation, Next Gen 911. And there are a ton of working groups. If you guys are interested in learning more about that, join a working group.
Let me just make one note in addition to what you had to say on NGCS, Drew, is that there are many other NGCS that are not related to spatial data that we're not necessarily going to be talking about today. So if you get into a discussion about NGCS ever, realize that ECRF and LVF are the ones you're concerned about because they have to do with GIS data, and SI isn't technically an NGCS, but it provisions data into the NGCS. Realize if you engage in that conversation that there is a broader definition for NGCS than just these particular elements.
I'm a GIS nerd. I have to wrap it around what I know.
Yeah. Yeah, and really it doesn't matter that much what those other things are to a GIS professional. So we're not going to spend our time talking.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, and let's talk through some important facts. So we've already identified that the 911 Center is also called the Public Safety Answering Point, or PSAP. We also have to acknowledge that 911 was introduced in 1968 in Haleyville, Alabama. So we're talking about an advancement in technology that's 50 years old. Over the last 50 years, we've seen very little improvements to 911, which is really why you're seeing a big push for NG911 right now. Because the small advances that we've seen, we've got E911, and I'm going to assume that not everyone, but most of you guys are E911 compatible or enhanced 911 that was introduced back in the early 90s. We saw a couple of iterations of E911. You saw E911, you had wireless phase 0, I believe, phase 1 and phase 2, which really worked to improve location identification accuracy as mobile devices became more and more popular. Well, now I think the number is what, 85% of all 911 calls are made from mobile devices. They're no longer made from landline phones. Well, this legacy 911 system that used copper lines was built for using landlines because we didn't need to have a spatial component to identify location, which is why you heard Jeff and I talk about the MSAG not being spatial. That was one of our questions, because the idea was your house phone number with your landline was connected to a database that showed your house number. That's an easy one-to-one match. When you call, you didn't need to map it. You just needed to know where it was from a reference map that was on the wall in the PSAP. Well, with a mobile device, this is mobile, it's not static. So my location's constantly changing, and that legacy system really is not built to support that functionality, which is why we've seen the minor improvements with E911, wireless phase 1, wireless phase 2. But we also identified that technology primarily relies on the MSAG and ALI as providing key elements for address verification. But they're not spatial. So how are we identifying location and something that can be inaccurate and incomplete? It's what we've had to work with. As we transition to NG911, we'll see that responsibility of location identification is going to start migrating away from the MSAG and ALI and have more emphasis on GIS data, which we can identify as being more accurate and more complete, or something that's a little easier to develop into a data set that is more accurate and more complete. And that's going to be major, and it puts GIS professionals kind of in a different seat when it comes to addressing their data. Right, so next generation 911 will transition legacy 911 databases, the MSAG and ALI, to the GIS professional GIS data. Wait, let me reread this again. Yeah. NG911 will transition legacy 911 data sets to GIS, making the 911 authority responsible for maintenance. So this addresses the question that we had earlier. It's, Jeff, you'll have to remind me of what document this is stated in, but the 911 authority becomes the responsible party for ensuring the accuracy of the data being used to support 911 in next generation 911. So what does that mean for you, the GIS professional? Is it taking that responsibility away from you? No. The assumption is that you are providing the most accurate data that you can to the 911 authority or the PSAP for provisioning for NG911. Right, but as things roll downhill, it rolls back to 911 first. It doesn't roll to GIS. Now, in the current environments that you're sitting in, where GIS is primarily supporting tax assessors, field mapping, parcel mapping, when someone identifies an error in the data, they call you. When an error is identified or an anomaly is identified in the GIS data in the PSAP, they call the PSAP. They don't call GIS. So that's kind of a transition there. That's why that relationship between GIS and public safety is going to be critical as you move forward. Location identification is still heavily dependent upon the caller's ability to verbally communicate where they are to the 911 call taker. That's a big kind of light bulb moment for me, is identifying that while we have all of this great location information, right? I can order pizza from wherever, but for 911, it's still largely, you know, it's only useful if I'm able to corroborate or identify where I'm located to the call taker so that they can compare that to what they're seeing on their screens.
There have been some Band-Aid offerings put in the marketplace, right?
Absolutely.
Rapid SOS is a good example of something that helps supplement that location on mobile devices, but it's not a native part of the 911 system, and it won't be a part of the next gen 911 system moving forward, that particular offering. But there will be things that will, you know, get native device location instead of interpolated device location. Instead of it taking time to get that interpolated device location, it'll be all, you know, well designed and in place in the next gen system.
Absolutely. And then the ALI and MSAG remain the key element for address verification in current state 911. Even though we can identify that those two data sets can be inaccurate and incomplete. And the reason we say inaccurate and incomplete is because they can go through ebbs and flows of maintenance. The ALI is owned by the telecommunicators. I think that's the next slide. So that's not really a database that you can touch much because you don't maintain it. The MSAG is a data set that you can request copies of. Sometimes they're free, sometimes you have to pay for them. It's a little different depending on who your provider is. But can you guarantee that anytime there's a change in GIS or anytime there's an anomaly identified, that those changes are being made across all data sets that leverage that information, MSAG included?
The other thing to note about this for the GIS professionals, these databases have been maintained by 911 professionals for 911 purposes, right?
That's a great point.
They don't really have a need to connect to a real world location in the current 911 system. So if something doesn't route and it's because it didn't fall within an address range, they just go into the MSAG and just sort of randomly increase it. I say randomly, it's not randomly, it's enough to get that call routed if it comes in again, but it may or may not have actually reflected the actual address range of that road. And it may have caught that particular problem and they solved that particular problem, but they may not have caught all the future problems that potentially could come up because they didn't necessarily need to go out, verify ranges, or they didn't have time. There's plenty of good reasons why they did the things they did. They were trying to get 911 calls to route that didn't route to route next time they called in. So those are valid reasons they come to the state of being inaccurate and incomplete because they did what they needed to do to a database and it didn't impact anybody else. So it was reasonable to do so. So Drew, I'm going to suggest at this point that we take a quick break because we've gotten through the facts and some introduction. And I think we're going to dive into a little more detailed information coming up here. So it might be a good time
Yeah.
You kind of take a stretch break, grab some coffee, take a bathroom break. What do you think? Come back at 10 o'clock Eastern?
It's 9:47 right now. You want to do like a 13-minute break?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, let's do that. I'm fine with that.
All righty. We'll see everybody in 13 minutes.
Yep. And if you, I'll stay here, and if you have any questions, throw them in the chat, or Kevin, go vocal with it. And happy to continue to engage on what you guys heard so far. Are you finding the information valuable, or are you learning about NG911 to this point? I think, one of the biggest fears I think we all have as presenters is, as we put this information together, we want to make sure that it's useful and it's valuable and that you're getting something out of it.
Sure. And again, apologies for being a little late, but I think one of the challenges today, and I'm just kind of looking through the attendant list, it looks like we have a really good mix of people that are in counties that have begun and or are implementing next gen. We have people in here that have not implemented next gen and are still on E911, which is good. And then I think there's a few people in here that don't have 911 directly under their purview.
That's okay.
Which is great.
Okay.
And I think especially because as you suggest, the addressing data authority, at least in my mind, the data steward really should be the addressing coordinator at the county level. And sometimes they share that responsibility then directly with municipalities who are, a subset of the addressing coordinator. They have their own 911 addressing standards and guides, and they provide data updates to the county coordinator. I guess I was also trying to make that distinction earlier about having the addressing coordinator. Sometimes that is not in the same office as the PSAP, and that was what I was trying to bring kind of to light. And that speaks to what you were saying about the term of the workflow, the transition between people that recognize data that's incorrect directly to the PSAP versus data that's now being presented by an addressing coordinator that's maybe going to the assessor's office or the planning department. So that's some of, yes, and those are some of the real good workflow issues.
Yeah. So what's great about the presentation, granted, we're only, still at the very beginning of the presentation. As we get deeper into the content, you see that it's going to touch on different components in local government. It's gonna hit you if you're the GIS person, if you're the addressing coordinator. We do speak to your role as the addressing coordinator. I actually have a whole nother presentation on that. And sure, while the standard states that the 911 authority is a responsible party for ensuring the accuracy of GIS data, in reality, you can't expect that. But what it does really draw attention to is developing those relationships and making sure that GIS is part of the conversation so that the 911 authorities are inclusive of others that manage data and provide data.
That's, Drew, that's a great point. And I think that is one of the biggest hurdles right now that we see in a lot of counties where the data that some counties have and maintain is good for now for them for 911 purposes. And that's their mandate. That's what they are paid to do.
Absolutely.
So it's hard for them to spend extra time, adjusting the data or attributing data that, doesn't benefit them, at least currently, but could benefit maybe, for example, the state as a whole.
Absolutely.
That's a real high bar to overcome with us, especially when it comes down to, that addressing coordinator is also wearing, 4 other hats. They're, doing other miscellaneous tasks. We just, the resources are slim in some of those counties. So
absolutely.
That's definitely a hard burden to overcome.
I'll tell you, Kevin, it's not just you guys, it's everybody. You know, when we think of how GIS has been used over the past 50 years, it's really to support land management and parcel management and addressing to a certain extent, right? Is it mappable? Can I assess property values? Can I do damage assessment? Can I identify relative location? We've seen accuracy become more and more of a very focalized topic over the past several years because we're identifying the value of accurate data, right? Well, as we get into the 911 conversation, it is truly a change for the GIS professional because now we're being put into this public safety space that we typically don't operate in, right? Sure, a couple of times a year, someone from 911 asks me for an update. I give it to them. They do whatever they do with it. I don't really care because if there's a problem, they'll let me know, right? So really what you're going to get out of this is you're going to see that GIS plays such a significant role that I'm going to encourage you to go sit at a PSAP, see how those call takers are using data, right? I had my staff go and sit down at a PSAP at least for one day and sit with a call taker. Sure, you know, it can be exciting, it cannot, but really when you're there, the call takers will ask you questions about data. They'll ask you if we have access to an unmarked landing strip field that they can throw in their CAD map because it'll be useful. I would never think about that because I think about street center lines, address points, fire hydrants, water valves, sewer lines. I think about that stuff because that's my daily job. So you'll see that, yeah, this is going to take some time, and it's going to take some time to really show that we're working together. I'm not trying to encroach in your domain.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm trying to help.
Yeah, I think there's some of that, or has been some of that in the state as well. But it's, I think a lot of people are coming, you know, they're seeing the benefits. You know, a lot of the work that we do with our flood tool, we use addresses and parcel data as its foundation. You know, we identify structures based on 911 address data, you know, so if that's not correct, then, you know, our analysis is wrong. And, you know, people's in the, so now you see the floodplain managers are using the, that site. They're able to look at the parcels, they're able to look at the addresses, and they know, because they're on the ground, they're local. So they know if, you know, something is missing or if it's not there. And, you know, sometimes they're in the same office as the addressing coordinator, and oftentimes they're not, right? So
for sure,
you know, it's starting to establish those types of connections. Is definitely, I think, brought a lot attention to data quality.
For sure. And, you know, there's a great comment in the chat right now. So thank you, Micah. Hope I'm saying that right. If I'm murdering your name, I apologize. It's not always the other person that's the problem. GIS folks can be the problem, right? I know how territorial I can be about my data. I know how territorial I can be about someone telling me something's wrong with my data because this is my job. Are you telling me I can't do my job? No, that's not it. So I will say yes, 100%. Ego will get in the way of some of these conversations. Absolutely. Whether you intend it to or not, it's going to happen, either from the GIS side or from the public safety side. And identifying that now is really understanding that we're both after the same thing. The most accurate data that we can provide to support current business practices and support NG911. That is the end goal. And it's going to require us to put some wall downs, to swallow a little bit of pride every now and then. If I tell you that you have an address point on the wrong side of the road, or you have a topology issue, it's not a stab at your professionalism and how well you do your job. It's we're working together to accomplish the same goal. That's what it is. So yeah, I have been the guy that was like, you can't have my data. I don't know what you're gonna do with it. Oh, and if you want it, I'm going to sell it to you. My own internal department. No, right. It's a lot of old school thought process too. This is changing the conversation.
I think too, and I don't remember, Drew, how much of this we have in today's slide deck, but there is data governance in place that if you're not in the throes of that data governance and understanding it, somebody may need to tell you no or not now because I have to go get permission from a data owner, and the data owner may or may not allow that for legitimate reasons. But I think this is an opportunity and a call to rethink data governance, just like public safety needs to now include GIS practitioners in their community. GIS practitioners need to include public safety in their community, so that as you're thinking through data governance and IT issues and things like that, you're thinking about those holistically and integrative way of public safety instead of exclusive of public safety.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Dalen has a really good comment, and I don't think you'll, or maybe you will get to some of this because it's not maybe a technical issue, but more of a authority issue. Or you know, she mentions that there are discrepancies between the addresses that the 911 center has and assigned potentially, and what citizens were actually using. You know, that brings up a whole host of good questions and issues that we.
I love that discussion. It gives me an opportunity to step up on my USPS soapbox. But no, you're absolutely right. The public perception of what's available, where they're at, and what the addresses are or are not varies from place to place, but can cause problems for sure. And so communicate, not only creating this great useful set of GIS data, but like using it everywhere, pushing out public maps so that people really understand what their addresses are, even bringing in, again, stakeholders. Who are the right stakeholders? We will talk about this. Who are the right stakeholders in the community has to include those elected officials and others that can make clear, even through regulation if necessary, what addresses are, should be, and are not. And that USPS soapbox goes this way, that they don't care, right, about where your building is, where your structure is. They care about where to deliver the envelope. Sometimes that's a box that's attached to a structure. Sometimes it's its own structure. And they're less concerned with where you are and more concerned about where to deliver. Appropriately is what they do, but they're not the addressing authority, and the public thinks they are sometimes. So that does turn into a problem.
All right, we're right at 10. Do we want to jump back into the slide deck?
Jump right into it.
Hey, one solution, if you guys can figure it out, is how to get all the delivery companies, UPS, FedEx, and everybody else that delivers packages to. For some reason, they have a hard time telling people that they don't live where they live.
Yeah. Well, and they are concerned with the structure, right? Because they actually do doorfront deliveries. So their data is awesome. The trouble with their data is proprietary. And even if you were able to get them to agree to share it with you, it would be very expensive.
Sometimes that may not apply to West Virginia.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, that may be true.
And the comment about Google, I can't tell you the number of times I would have citizens walk in my office, knock on the door and say, when are you going to update Google? I can't.
Yeah. Well, and Google's a similar discussion as USPS. What does Google use this data for? Advertising, right? So if you're in rural West Virginia and there's not that many, it's sparsely populated, they don't care about your addresses because there's not enough densification to make money on the advertising, or at least as much money as they would in a denser suburban urban area where they're going to focus their resources. So, you have to think about this in terms of being GIS professionals. We think about it every data set we have, right? What's the purpose of the database? What's the purpose of the data that I'm building? And we're going to build it around that purpose. And so if I built it for and we'll talk about this too, right? If I built that road center line to be about transportation, then I'm not going to be that concerned about address ranges. So it has to be, data that you have has to be built or retrofitted to meet the needs and purpose of 911 and public safety as well throughout this process. So yeah, I'd say go for it, Drew, on the MSAG.
All right, we're going to dive a little deeper into the MSAG and the alley here. But first, I want to really define the MSAG for you as it's defined by NENA and their master glossary. Is a database of street names and house number ranges within their associated communities, defining emergency service zones and their associated emergency service numbers to enable proper routing of 911 calls. So if we break that down, the MSAG is simply a spreadsheet that is helping you keep track of your street center line segment ranges, right? So it's your 100 block, your 200 block, your 300 block, and associates them to the emergency service zones using emergency service numbers that really relate to call routing and dispatching, resource dispatching, right? As we stated earlier, though, there's no spatial component to this. It is an Excel spreadsheet that I can change and manipulate to fit the need of right now. So if I have a call that's unroutable because it falls out of range, I can access my MSAG and adjust the range so that if I get another call from that same location, it will route correctly. And routing in this instant is routing me to the street segment, not to a specific point on the segment, which is typically what we would think about when we do routing.
Well, and I'm sorry to interrupt, Drew, but just to be clear about what a street segment is, these segments in this MSAG are all about what's contained within an ESN. So a street segment in GIS database is concerned about what's contained within this stretch between breaks. Well, there may be many GIS street segments to one MSAG street segment.
That's a good point. Thank you, Jeff. And again, non-spatial, but it has a very spatial function to it. And then the alley is the automatic display of the PSAP of the caller's telephone number, so landline, the address location of the telephone, and supplementary emergency services information of the location from which a call originates. So if we look at our spreadsheet here, we can see our house number. We have our confidential information on the far left, which is that number, that's our landline or our business line, our house number, our street name, our street type, our community names, our states, a customer name, so who that number is assigned to. And then we also have our ESN. So we have the ESN in our MSAG and our ESN in our alley, which help with the call routing component. But again, that's all these are doing. They're not connecting to an actual spatial location. They're just showing that this number is associated to this house number and this address and this has this emergency service number that falls in this emergency service boundary. So it's all relational, but not spatial. And we're moving away from that. One, I mean, it's great to move away from the alley because most people are using cell phone numbers now, are using cell, but still moving away from the non-spatial data to something that is more spatial like GIS is a logical progression. And that's where we're going to see the spatial component have a decision-making function in 911, whereas these do not. All right, now more specific, let's talk about next generation 911. So current, so we're going to brief it with some more current state. Location data sourced from telecommunications companies right now. That's your alley. Your alley database is managed and maintained by a telco, not by locals. And then routing 911 calls to appropriate public safety answering points, again, currently does not use spatial data. So this is repetitive for a reason, to show you how important MSAG and alley are in current state 911 and moving away from it. But we also can identify that 98% GIS data synchronization is acceptable.
Like that pie chart's on fire.
I love that. would you consider 98% synchronization? So let's really break that down and what it's telling us, because this is from an informational document that Nina produced that states 98% is acceptable. We're just synchronizing the attribution. So the geospatial data attribution with the MSAG and LA database is looking for a 1-to-1 match. So if 98% of that's there, we're good. Well, what about the spatial accuracy of the data? Doesn't matter here. Just the tabular component of the data.
Not only that, Drew, but what about the things that have nothing to do with road center lines, address points, right? We have a whole set of GIS data feature classes that need to be developed in addition to synchronization.
Absolutely.
So synchronization is a good first step. That's the way I would characterize it. If you trust your MSAG, if it's usable and worthy of the effort. But this idea that if you get there, you're ready is not right.
Absolutely. And then in a future state, we know that we're completely overhauling the infrastructure. So we're building the EZNet, we're moving things into an IP environment. It's going to allow us to transfer larger data and more data like GIS, as well as more data from the caller, so that we can improve location accuracy, and we can, which is going to help us improve response. But it's also going to hopefully address and decrease risk of a call going to the wrong PSAP, because you're right on the border. We can go out right now and we can find several examples of misrouted calls because they hit the wrong tower, or they hit the closest tower, which was in a cell sector for this PSAP, but not that PSAP. There are a ton of different reasons this happens.
Yeah, and I think the thing to acknowledge about this complete overhaul and this wrecking of what's existing, in essence, and replacing it wholesale, is that the technology really demands it, right?
Mm-hmm.
The fact is that AT&T, Verizon, even rural telephone networks are switching to IP-based networks for voice communication. Even your cell phone, they're largely out there, even on 5G, voice over LTE, right? Voice over 5G, VoLTE, or voice over 5G. So they're sending even voice transmissions via data now. And so it doesn't make any sense to continue to use a system and infrastructure that was really built only to transmit voice to be sort of handcuffed for 911. And so it's not only public expectation of this, but the technology that's out there now for quote unquote calls demands this update in technology and infrastructure for 911.
I'm reading some of the, this is why when my internet goes out, my cell signal also goes out too.
Yeah, that's right. You got it.
I'm sorry, that's not fun. All right, we're also seeing a shift from stakeholders, being the telecommunicator companies, to the 911 authorities, right? This is relating directly to who's responsible for the data, who's controlling and managing the data that's being used to provide this locational awareness and locational accuracy for call routing and dispatch routing. Because data starts local, that is the most accurate data set that we should have. We will now be in control of that, ideally, right? The GIS data providers, the public safety authorities, all working together, the addressing authorities working together to provide accurate data to support current business practices, as well as supporting this transition to next generation 911, and maintaining a level of accuracy that we all understand. One of the big issues I've had in the past with an MSAG or an ALI, outside of not knowing how often those databases were being addressed or being maintained, was I didn't know how often I was getting a copy of them, right? If I was getting a copy once a year, how many changes were occurring over the year? Whereas the GIS data management component in my office, I'm well aware of that cycle and how often I can update that data. to ensure what's being used in 911 is the most accurate available today. So that's a really important shift there. And then based on standard, and then it's a new architecture that's based on standardized and open data sets and technologies, the I3 architecture. So that's that ESINet environment that is standardized. It does the open databases. What's that component for this, Jeff?
Yeah, the standards are based on GIS, OGC standards, right? So it doesn't require Esri software. It doesn't require any particular platform of GIS software, but rather OGC compliant formats. So the service oriented architectures we're actually going to be sharing the data are going to be the WMS, WFS formats rather than, you know, REST or any other proprietary systems.
Had a little brain lapse there. I appreciate that. And it's going to require our GIS data to extend beyond 90% synchronization, 98% synchronization, because we're going to look at more than just the tabular synchronization. We're going to look at the spatial accuracy of the data. We're going to think, as Jeff was alluding to earlier, beyond how we're currently looking at how we're synchronizing our data just to meet the requirements for MSAG and ALI. We now actually get to look at GIS and everything that we're able to do with GIS, right? The required data layers, the optional layers that can be used that extend beyond just a road range or a home phone number. And then to wrap it all up, we kind of want to go through each of those slides that we just saw and put it together here on one slide for you. Quickly recap current state, how it is today. We can identify that data today for 911 lacks completeness and is based on 50-year-old technology that we all know needs enhancing, and we're doing that. Routing calls to the appropriate or the correct public safety answering point, or PSAP, currently does not use spatial data, and we're operating in a system that says 98% data synchronization is okay. And we know that it needs to be more, but as we're shifting into NG911, we identified it's a complete overhaul and redesign of legacy 911 from the bottom up. There's a shift in who's responsible for the data and provides more ownership and power and responsibility back to locals to ensure data being used to make those critical decisions is accurate and they can control. It is based on standardization and open databases, the open data standards and OGC that Jeff just spoke to. We can aggregate and reconcile GIS data for thousands of municipalities and counties and states across the country. So the end goal of NG911 is to be an interconnected network across all 50 states so that we can share data and we can transfer calls to any state. That's why that OGC, that open dataness, is extremely important, so that we no longer fall off a cliff when we get to the county line. We can share data with our neighbors, and we know that their data is as accurate as ours because we validated it and we've checked it and we communicate across boundaries. We're not isolated into our primary PSAP spatial extent. We need to think about how our data is connecting to our neighbors' data, and we need to be able to see it as well. NG911 is going to allow us to accurately route calls to the more than 4,900 PSAPs that exist in the United States. And we're going to extend beyond that 98% data synchronization requirement and really build out to provide the best data possible. Will it ever be 100%? No, but you can shoot for the 5 nines, 99.999% accurate. And that's going to require a lot of improved workflows, improved communication, and a process that allows you to continue to validate data as you're addressing anomalies with your data. And we do talk about that later in the presentation. All right, now I love this. This is a slide that we use quite a bit because, simply put, NG911 is the IP-based system that allows digital information, voice, photos, videos, text. So think beyond just voice here to flow seamlessly from the public through the 911 network and to the emergency responder. That's a huge capability that we're going to add by moving to an NG911 environment and really overhauling that infrastructure. We're going to have the ability to provide more information to our public safety professionals and not just have to rely on voice alone anymore. We'll have the ability to provide photo, to provide videos, to provide text, to ensure my safety as someone requesting help, and provide the required and necessary information for the call taker to make sure I get the type of help that I need as quickly as possible. And then I love that AT&T wrote a letter
Oh, sorry.
to the FCC asking their permission to phase out their analog. So this is what Jeff was speaking to earlier. A lot of our telco companies are getting out of the analog business. They're moving into the IP. They're moving into the digital because it's valuable and it's important. It's going to allow for more data transfer.
Well, what's really notable about that too, Drew, is that letter came in 2014. And it was basically AT&T saying to the FCC, you need to figure out how to get us off of here because we're getting out of the business whether we have permission or not.
Yeah.
They're already switched all of their things to things they can manage by software instead of by physically moving switches and physically plugging cables. They can do it all via software. So they're really the ones that were kind of they gave impetus to this transition, and it's still kind of drug on this long to get to the point where it is very much patchwork across the country.
Absolutely.
Yep, that's right, James. They
Yeah.
sold their pots, plain old telephone service, copper lines there.
All right, so we've talked about the new infrastructure and I did a horrible job copying this slide over to this template.
Pretty jacked up.
Sorry, Kevin.
I guess the good news is that it doesn't matter that you actually know all of the details,
No,
but rather that you know
there you go.
that GIS covers a significant portion of it, right?
Pretty much. And if you go to the next slide, Jeff, it's actually a better display.
Yeah.
Because what we just showed you was the current state architecture, and this is what it's moving to, right? You've got your VoIP, your wireless, your landline, the originating call service provider. You can start to see the spatial interface, the list, the location validation function, the ECRF, those different functional components that we defined earlier. Now you see them how they fit in the architecture. From the originating service provider, so you making the call, how that flows through the core service environment, including GIS, the top right. You see the 911 authority's GIS data provisioned into the spatial interface that's distributed to ECRF and LVF to perform those location functions using GIS data from locals. That's why accuracy of the data is important, and it has to go beyond 98% accuracy. And then it makes its way to the call taker. So from the time I hit send to call 911 to the time someone picks it up, it's that machine-to-machine process that Jeff was speaking to that's leveraging GIS to make decisions on where to send the call. Is there data to support the location? Is there data to support routing the call correctly? And if not, what happens? All that happens in there. And now we're going to define it out a little better for you guys. So the EZNet is a network that's managed by local, regional, or state entities. And it can be all three at the same, well, probably not all three at the same time. In Maryland, they are setting up regional EZNets because we have counties that are moving faster than the state, but then you have other localities where they're building statewide EZNets, but they're doing it in a phased approach, starting regionally and working up to statewide connected network. It's a network that can be multi-purpose. It is a secured network. It supports extending public safety communication services in addition to 911. So it's a larger network that's not specifically for 911 calls. It also assumes that EZNets are hierarchical, right? They're a network of networks starting local to regional to state to national over time. I mean, what, the next 20 years, we hope to have a national EZNet in place?
Yeah, and even interconnecting internationally, which isn't an issue in West Virginia, but I lived in San Diego for a number of years, and there is a big link between Tijuana and San Diego. So there will be a need to interconnect American networks with Mexican networks, and similarly along Canada's border. I mean, I guess theoretically up in Alaska to Kamchatka, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, and we've started to see certain areas, certain provinces in Canada have adopted NENA's NG911 standards, and they're moving towards building out their own NG911 environments that will help connect, you know, Canada to North America where it makes sense. I haven't heard if Mexico's doing the same thing, but I can only imagine it's a matter of time.
Yeah, that's right. It's just a matter of time, because the providers, again, aren't going to maintain these copper line networks anymore, even in Mexico. So technology marches on, so the 911 infrastructure has to react to that.
Right. And then our list, our location information server, that's that subscriber database. Very much like the alley. It's probably more of an evolution of the alley. It's an element that's maintained by originating service providers, so your AT&Ts. It functions like the alley database to provide the location of the 911 caller. Still operates much of the same function as the alley. Do I get more access to it though? I don't know.
You don't. It's still a proprietary database about customers with confidential information. So
I want access to it. I'm a data guy.
Yeah.
All right, the two functions that I really like that are in this environment, mostly because I'm a GIS dude. This is where the location validation function, the emergency call routing function, my GIS data from my spatial interface is distributed to the location validation function to pre-validate the static location of a caller. So it pre-validates the location against your GIS. Any errors or anomalies that are identified are reported back to the data authority. In this case, that would be the 911 authority for analysis and update. So there's a validation component in there, which I think is really cool. And is also a place that's going to generate those discrepancy reports for more than one unique location found. So if you have duplicate address points in your GIS data, the LVF will identify it, create a report, submit that report back to the 911 authority that then would get distributed to the data maintainer.
Yeah, and in fact, Drew, this is going to really force the hand of the GIS professional who built a database for other purposes, right?
Absolutely.
You're not going to be able to, it will not provision 2 points with the same civic location address information. It just won't do it. And in fact, depending on the provider, it may reject the entire data set because it found some duplicates. Right. The good news is they'll tell you which duplicates they are, so you can go iron them out. But this is going to be one of those push points of where the GIS professional has to begin to adjust their thinking about how the data should be designed and retrofit it back to NG911 purposes. That doesn't mean that all should be thought of in that context of master data management, right? It doesn't mean that I delete both of those duplicate points, but it does mean that I designate one as the NG911 address, and the second one that's not designated that doesn't get into the data set that gets put into the SI.
Yeah, and so I should have started this slide deck with an apology for the GIS folks, because in some aspects this is another hat for you to wear, and understanding how to manage and maintain your current GIS data to not only support those existing business practices, but how you may need to make minor changes to also support 911 because of these discrepancy reports that can get created in LVF and ECRF, which is, so ECRF is identifying where does this call go? So based on where you're calling from, what PSAP gets the call so that they can send you service. So it determines the correct 911 call center where the call is routed. It performs a spatial query against your PSAP boundary, which is originating in GIS. And then it validates the location differently than the LVF, but uses the same data. So it's validating against your address points in your road center lines as well. So again, if you remember earlier, I said, look, as we move into this conversation, GIS is going to have a bigger seat at the table. And these two functions really lead the head of that seat because you're the data maintainers. You're responsible for making, one, ensuring that the data that you give to 911 is somewhat doesn't have these issues in there. So pre-validating your data. And if discrepancies are found, that you can fix them and fix them in a certain amount of time because it's supporting 911. We'll get into that here in a minute.
And I want to make real explicit that pre-validation means it's not part of the call routing process, but it is a next-gen core service, right? So LVF is a next-gen core service, but it is not used in the actual routing of an emergency call. Only the ECRF in these GIS elements are used in the actual routing process of a in progress 911 call.
That's a good point. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
All right, then I wanted to throw just a quick slide in here on funding, because somebody's got to pay for this network, right? Somebody's got to pay for this. I know it's a big topic of conversation, but there's a ton of different ways to slice it. CARES Act, there were identified aspects of CARES Act that could be used to support not directly NG911, but GIS data improvements. We had the federal NG911 grant in 2019 that is running close to end of life. I think it ends next year, beginning of next year sometime, Q1 or Q2. In legislation right now is the Lift America Act that they've identified funding for 911 there. So that's going to be very interesting for folks to pay attention to. But then also local budgeting. Have you thought about putting together large, small, medium-sized projects that really focus on data enhancement and data improvement for NG911? One of the biggest issues I've run into and I've dealt with personally as a GIS director is it's hard to get local decision makers to think about GIS as anything other than mapping. They don't necessarily connect the map itself and reverse engineer that to the accuracy of the data that's being shown on the map, yet we're assumed to be providing the most accurate information that we have. And we do for what we're currently being asked to support, but we may not as we move towards NG911. So what kind of projects could you put together that really shine a light and focus on data accuracy for NG911 that also improves the data that you provide to your tax assessors, the data that you provide to your parcel mappers, the data that you may provide out to your developers, right? It's the same pot of data that's being used to support all of these different functions, only for 911, we're not often thought about because we're the mapping guys. We're the data folks too. So think about that as you're having these conversations. There's no two way, there's no way about it. It's going to cost money. A lot of folks I know are going to look to the state to make decisions, and that's okay because the state will get there. How can you start addressing this locally as well so that you can take a step forward, or at least start wrapping your head around some of these ideas? That's all I have in here on funding. If you have any questions, throw them in the chat, reach out to me. I'll give you what I can. This is all that's out there right now that I know of. Jeff, do you know of any other funding opportunities that locals may be able to look at?
Yeah, not if there aren't any sort of regional ones. I'm sorry, I said regional. I meant that the state's not necessarily funding grants or funding policy that would specifically address this. I'm not aware of any others.
Right, and outside of a 911 board that may exist at a state, If you look at Maryland, they have the Maryland 911 board. Florida's got a 911 board that are also funding mechanisms because they provide grants for 911 projects that also include NG911 and GIS. So there could be some opportunities that I'm just unaware of that exist in the state. But from a federal level, this is what I know of that's out there right now. All right, then let's really look at your role or my role or our role. As data stewards for our localities, we are going to be asked to identify and reduce silos. This goes back to my previous comment about being looked at as the mapping department. And some of this may be re-educating folks on what we actually do as GIS professionals. This is also an encouragement to the public safety community as well. This is not just a GIS deal. Most public safety folks are used to asking GIS for data, but may not do a really good job of explaining or educating GIS on how that data is being used to support their job functions, and vice versa. So that gets us to our next slide, that as we identify and reduce silos, we have to really create these crosswalks of understanding and develop better understanding of who's operating what role so that we can improve workflows, reduce duplication of effort, and really understand our data supply chains. What data is mine that I manage versus what data is coming from DOT, or what data is coming from a university, a college, a state university. I know that happens in Virginia and Mississippi, because that's going to dictate how I'm able to use that data or identify if I can use that data at all to support something like NG911. So create these crosswalks, identify and reduce silos where you can. Understand that some of this is going to take time. And if we look at a real world example, the workflow between an MSAC coordinator and a GIS coordinator are very similar. Both address issues with road center lines and street data where something's out of range or something's added, new subdivision gets built. The GIS coordinator may input the new subdivision with the roads, but may have to coordinate with the MSAC coordinator to really make sure the road ranges that were provided by the developer work for 911. The MSAC coordinator, I was going to walk through that a little bit more, Jeff. Both entities are researching discrepancies within their data. The MSAC coordinator is really focused on updating the MSAC, but are they also coordinating those corrections to GIS? And is GIS coordinating their revisions to the MSAC coordinator as it relates to road center lines? And then both are responsible for making additions and providing updates, but are they talking to each other? This is an example of a silo that I know exists in local government now because it existed in my locality, where we were operating the same functions, but weren't communicating with each other to ensure my changes went up and their changes came down, or vice versa, right? It also could be something where that role could be delegated to me or to the MSAC coordinator, eliminating the opportunity to interject error because two people are kind of working on the same thing, although it's in different capacities. This is a really good example. All right, then our next slide is identifying who's currently at the table. Traditionally with 911, fire, police, EMS, public safety, that's the core stakeholder group of 911 as it has been. Some localities it still exists this way, and these guys don't always have to get along with each other. I know that fire chiefs and police chiefs like to butt heads sometimes, but this is that core group. As we get into NG911, we've got to pull more people to the table because it's going to require service from a larger community. So we have to think about adding GIS to this stakeholder group. We've got to think about adding the planning department. We have to think about IT and the role of IT in NG911 and supporting our local infrastructure, or building out our local infrastructure to support this.
Hey, Drew.
Hey, Kevin.
I'm sorry.
That's
But
okay.
I just wanted to pause on that point real quick because, that's a good point for you're saying next gen is a catalyst. And if you go back a slide, one thing that we're looking at right now is that, currently our state system has a composite of the ESNs. And as we start to get data in, we're starting to see counties provide it, their distinct fire boundaries, their distinct, law enforcement, et cetera.
Right.
My question is, do you see a role for the GIS component to be able to start while they're changing, or I don't want to say change boundaries, but while they're doing this with the boundaries, to better enhance the boundaries? I mean, I know there's tons of different tools that we could use to actually redraw boundaries based on a response time and service areas, things like that. And I know a lot of these boundaries are legacy from literally hand-drawn paper maps, that type of thing. So I was just wondering if you could touch on that really briefly.
Yeah, I'll touch it a little bit, and I'm sure Jeff's got some really good comments here. I know he's done some work there. Absolutely. Right. Boundaries are visual. You're right. A lot of boundaries are legacy, and they were done on desktops from our grandfathers who argued over who could get to the barn the fastest, right? Using parcel lines as they were drawn whenever they were created. And as they continue to just migrate year over year, can you see where some of those boundaries may split a house or split a parcel, or don't incorporate response times, or force you to go outside of a boundary to come back into a boundary to access a location that's in your boundary? Is that really efficient? So yes, I do think there's room for GIS at the table as you're addressing boundaries. Jeff, I would love to get some thoughts from you because I know you've directly been involved with some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple perspectives that I want you to think about boundaries in. First is the next generation 911 boundaries only relate to routing of calls, not necessarily routing of responders. In most cases, those two things are the same, but in some cases, because of automatic mutual aid and other things like that, it may not be. So for instance, a fire service boundary where there's, in the fire discipline, there's lots of handshake agreements. Sometimes those handshake agreements are memorialized in automatic or mutual aid agreements. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes there's kind of like this drag the dead body across the line so I don't have to fill out the report kind of mentality. And so those are kind of the challenges in boundaries, and those represent the best opportunities to update boundaries. But those boundaries are more useful in a dispatch system, a CAD dispatch system, than they are in the next-gen 911 call routing system. Where in the next-gen 911 system, you really need to be focused on where does a call from this location need to be answered? Or where does a call from this location need to be transferred to for fire EMS or law in the rare case? And so that's what you really have to think about when you're talking about PSAP boundaries, emergency service boundaries of fire, law, and EMS, is where does the call get routed to? So there absolutely is an opportunity, but it's important to note that there's operational response and then there's 911 call routing response as well.
Sure, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. So start thinking locally about who else you can add to the table, because they're all going to play a significant role, potentially. Right, I'm not telling you that you have to have somebody from planning or from public works, but think about the value that they add to the conversation. All right, roles and responsibilities. So this is going to be more of a high level and really looked at the role of public safety in 911, the addressing authority, and then GIS data providers. Completely understanding that in some localities, your addressing authority and your GIS data provider may be the same person, or GIS may sit at public safety, so the addressing authority sits at public safety. But when we look at roles, we know that from a public safety standpoint, we've got our primary PSAP, and they're the responsible party for the data being used for NG911. The addressing authorities pretty self-explanatory. They assign addresses throughout the county and kind of manage and maintain that function for our localities. And the GIS data providers manage everything else as it relates to GIS. But these are there's a lot of cross functionality between what each of these roles do. And as we go down into the next slide, we can see that traditionally, these guys somewhat, but not always, are willing to work together. We can see that the GIS data provider and the addressing authorities, because these can oftentimes be the same person, have a great working relationship. Because think about what they're doing. They're providing GIS data and assigning new addresses. That supports current functionality for most localities: parcel mapping, tax assessment, just land planning. The new player to this game for us on this side is going to be public safety. But these groups have to work together to be successful in an NG911 environment, because we require the expertise of all of these entities to ensure that the data is accurate, that it's timely, and we have to build those crosswalks to even get there. So we all provide some value to the conversation, but more often than not, you don't see this collective working together like this. They're departmentalized. They're very siloed in what their functions are and what they do. And we have to figure out how to break out of that. Now, if you're not in that situation and you're here where public safety, GIS, and the addressing authority have a great relationship already, you're already a step ahead. Now think about who else you can add to that group of stakeholders that's going to impact 911 and the data being used to support 911 as you move forward, so that you can identify workflows, start building some efficiencies, and create better communication.
And I think it's important to note that we took these roles and these definitions from NINA standards. They're officially defined there. And to Drew's last point, that may or may not reflect all of the roles and responsibilities that are out there. There definitely needs to be support by IT, by Public Works, who, puts up the signs on the streets. That coordination should be going on with public safety already, but may or may not be. So those other support entities that need to support these three should be thought of as well.
Absolutely. All right, and then I want to touch base back on the EZNet and kind of its, what it's supposed to be is a network of networks that starts sub-regional and local, filters up to regional, state, national, and international. The purpose of the interconnected network is to reduce redundancies and create backups where possible, and the ability to transfer call and data to the correct PSAP should something be misrouted or you need additional help. Gonna spend just a very little bit of time on this because we've talked about it.
And let me just make an additional comment, is that at every one of these levels, data has to be aggregated for the appropriate area, right?
Yeah.
So it's easy enough to think about, okay, these networks interconnect, and so they can share data across these networks. But they also call for, excuse me, they also call for data to be aggregated at these different levels as well, because for instance, the i3 spec is going through a new iteration, version 3. And it is going to be a new requirement for what's called a map database service, which is really a visualization of the data that will route 911 calls, so that if calls transit across these network of networks and from network to network, that the entity that would be answering that call has some geographic context and visualization of what they're being called to dispatch response into. So that network of network idea has to not only be discussed about IP networks and next-gen core services, but the data that supplies them as well.
Really good point with the data aggregation. And then some different ways to deploy an EZNet. Self-contained PSAP, enterprise, or regionally. So it requires cooperation and regionalization, whether you are a self-contained PSAP and you perform all three of those roles with the addressing authority, the GIS authority, and PSAP, it's all within the PSAP itself, or you have an enterprise environment where your PSAP is one entity, addressing sits in planning and building assessment, and then GIS is its own department. Each are going to roll the data up the same way to that regional shared governance and common aggregation platform to support the ESINet. So identify now or early in the process, do you have an enterprise environment where everyone's kind of disparate and you need to bring each other together to start those communications and those crosswalks? Or is everything self-contained in one building at the PSAP? I don't know how often that is or how common that is. It's never been common in any localities that I've supported. And just understand how those roles need to work together to accomplish the same goal, and start looking at, I really like what Jeff was speaking to on the previous slide with the data aggregation component. I think even for me, that's something that I don't reference enough when you start thinking outside of your boundaries and providing data to a regional locality or to a state locality. There is an aggregation component that you've got to think about, and who's going to execute that.
Yeah, look, there's a great comment in here from Jeffco. Says they've already been working on that. So that's really
Nice.
great. You've been looking at each other's data sets, making sure that you have points that come together at the right points and on agreed to basis is really smart and good forward thinking activity. And I would recommend that for everybody to be thinking about.
Yeah, 100%. Good for you.
Drew, and that, just to tie in our conversation earlier with Virginia, and that they've started discussions with all the county adjacent counties with Virginia and West Virginia, discrepancies between boundaries, and they've started working through a lot of those areas as well. So it's
Nice.
it's coming. It's ready or not.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good note, Kevin, is that it's coming whether you want it to or not. So you may as well get ahead of the curve and not be caught unawares.
Which is a big reason for this workshop, right? To start providing that education, identifying areas that you can start making action against. All right, let's talk about some GIS basics. And I know this is a GIS group, but just in case there are some folks that don't really know what GIS is, we're going to break things down a little bit. So GIS is spatial data that is referenced in some way to locations on the earth. To define that in our mapping environments, we refer to that data as layers, right? Those are points, lines, or polygons, whatever we need to use to mimic or imitate the real world in a virtualized environment. We use GIS to do that. And it's also the differences between spatial and non-spatial data. We require spatial data to do mapping functions using layers and points, lines, and polygons. And what's great about this environment is we can pretty much define whatever we want. Whether we can see it or not see it, we can define it because it is spatial in nature. So we have on the left, we've got our points. These points can be whatever we want them to be. In this case, they're going to be houses. In the middle, we have our line network that looks like roads, so let's call them roads. And on the right, we have our polygons. Can you guess it? Yes, those are our parcels. And individually, they tell great stories, but when you mash them together, you have the ability to tell a better, more accurate story and start defining how one impacts the other and how they're relational in nature, which is space in itself. So the ability to combine all these different types of data sets together creates a better picture, meaning geography, while important, the ability to understand the information behind what we're trying to locate geographically is slightly a little more important. So the I in GIS for me is very important. And just, I want to throw this definition in there because GIS is often referred to by a lot of different things, depending on who you ask on what day. I guarantee you at some point in time, for all of my GIS folks on here, someone said, hey, what do you do for a living? And you say, I do GIS. Oh, well, what's that? And you have replied, I make maps. Because identifying GIS as a system designed to capture, store, manipulate, analyze, manage, and present all types of geographical data just doesn't flow as well off of the tongue. It's easier to say, I make maps. Well, we've done ourselves a significant disservice over the past 50 years by saying that, because now people think that's all we do. They forget that a large portion of what we do is data related. And in the next gen 911 world, we're going to have to re-educate some folks that we do more than make maps to be significant in the conversation or even be thought of in the conversation. Right, so GIS in public safety traditionally has not been a core technology or mission critical for public safety. Sure, we provide data to the call center so that they can update their CAD maps, but we might do it once a month, we might do it once a quarter, we might do it whenever it's asked for. So it's easy to understand why getting into this NG911, we're having to really build a strong case for why GIS is important, because traditionally we've only supported CAD. We've not really supported call routing in any aspect. We've provided situational awareness maps. We've created some apps and programs that are relative to public safety using different data sets, but we've never really addressed the data itself to identify if it was ready to support call routing or support 911 from that decision-making aspect. We just haven't done it because we haven't needed to. Well, in an NG911 environment, we're kind of required to. That's really, in my opinion, the cornerstone of what's going to make NG911 successful. Garbage in, garbage out, we've always heard that in GIS. It is no more true than now with NG911. If you throw inaccurate data in there, you're going to get discrepancy reports spit back out at you. You're going to be forced to make a decision or make a change, because as the accuracy of the data is really extremely, it's no more important than it is now, but you're going to have a checks and balance against it in the NG911 environment. So let's look at some implications of data quality and data completeness. So this is a big one. Is 98% synchronization really a measure of accuracy of data? So we identify that this comes from the 2009 informational document published by NINA. That document is called Synchronizing Geographic Information System Databases with MSAG and ALI, and it's 71501. If you're in those NINA conversations, like I love talking to Jeff about this because he just refers to the document as 71501. I actually have to go look it up to see what it is, but he's been doing that for a while, right? But it was designed to help agencies undertake synchronization of legacy 911 databases and GIS data for the I2 architecture or E911. It's identified as a good starting point, but it does not produce NG911 ready GIS data. So if you really want something to read, go check out this document. And I think it actually identifies how often you should synchronize your data sets. But it really lacks on that vision and focuses on that as being just a tabular synchronization and a tabular comparison. But for next gen, we've already identified why we have to move beyond 98% and develop our data towards the I3 architecture. We have to address the dimensions of data quality beyond that initial 98% synchronization. We have to develop new data layers. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. I don't want to give you a information that's on a slide and just kind of be a little premature with it. But yes, as GIS professionals, you may have to create new data layers. And we need to take this regionalized data governance and management approach. How is the data that we're creating locally going to impact those that touch us and those within the state, thinking about that EZNet environment and NG911? There is also an error resolution requirement. So NINA requires data to be corrected. Any anomalies that are identified in that EZNet environment Remember, I told you that LVF and ECRF will spit out a discrepancy report if it doesn't like something. That is that error resolution component. It states that you've got 3 business days to correct it. So that's reporting, correction, reprovisioned back into the ESINet. Do you currently have the resources available to support that kind of deadline? Completely understanding that delays resulting from incorrect 911 call routing can really have a life-threatening effect. So just looking at NG9, just looking at the 98% synchronization accuracy from NINA just isn't good enough, right? We have to look beyond 98% synchronization. We've got to think about the data itself, not just from a tabular component, but the spatial component as well. Do we have gaps or overlaps in our boundary information? Are we missing road centerline breaks? Do we have a discrepancy in road types or road names or community values? Do we have duplicate address points? Are we identifying suites or apartment numbers? How are we defining colleges and universities? So there's so many more questions to ask when thinking about the quality of your data that you're using for NG911. So GIS data, oh, sorry. No, you're fine. You're fine there. This is just repetitive. This is actually perfect. All of the slides in this deck is my favorite slide because I wish I would have been in tune to this 15 years ago when I started this. And it's really to think about the dimensions of data quality, regardless of if it's for NG911, although we're going to focus on NG911 here. Is the data that I require to do my job, is it available? If I'm the data steward, if I own the data, yes, it's available. For me, do I make it easily available to others that may need it to support their functions? Is all the required data present? So the mandatory attributes for NG911 or the mandatory data attribution for any other system I may support, is it currently being supported where I have it or supported in the data set? So that addresses data completeness. Does it reflect the real world? So is it accurate? How accurate is my data? And not only is it accurate, I'm going to skip to number 5, is it consistent? So if I'm using a point in the middle of a structure to identify a habitable structure or a home, am I consistent across the entire database with using that methodology, that point placement methodology? And then is the data available when I need it? This really addresses your current practices for how often you update data, how often you distribute those updated data sets to other departments, which I think does a really good job of speaking back to earlier in our presentation, the comment about setting up the service-oriented architecture. Jeff, I wrote that down because I love it, and I feel like we need to do something with that. But yes, absolutely. If you're in a habit of creating and exporting shape files to do updates for other departments, can we improve that and make it a little more efficient, make it a little more accurate? And it's not so reliant on capturing static copies of data. Can we establish an environment that allows near real-time data accuracy to be transitioned to whoever wants it whenever they want it? It doesn't have to rely on putting in a service request or a ticket or sending an email to the GIS coordinator to grab a copy of a data set that really the next day it's outdated. So those are some really good things to think through when you start thinking about the data you currently have and how you can make some data improvements to support NG911 as well as support existing business practice. Yeah, love that slide. And then really want to get into address numbers here. So NINA recommends an address point for every 5.28 feet. While that's a NINA recommendation, I know locals can have different requirements. So NINA recommends this. If this is not your standard in your localities, what is your standard? Do you have one? By doing every 5.28 feet, it allows for 1,000 unique numbered addresses per mile of the road. So every 5,280 feet, or there's 5,280 feet in a mile, right? So that makes sense. It's easy for an emergency service provider in the event of an emergency to quickly look and figure out where an address may be. So based on that road range and that home number, about how far down that street segment would the house be? If that's the standard, like 500 Alpine Street would put you right in the middle of the segment. So that's a reason why we use standards, but that is a NENA standard. I think that's also a USPS standard, every 5.28 feet.
Yeah, I think it's important to note the difference between standards and best practices too. This comes from a NENA, in fact, it's the next one, right?
Just a best practice document.
Yeah, best practice document that suggests that it's easier. It's easy. I put quotes, right? It's a good practice to do this 5.28 feet because it allows those 1,000 units. But the reason it's not a standard is there's plenty of places where that doesn't actually work that well, right? And so instead of trying to impose it as something everybody should do, they say it's a really good practice to do if it works for you.
That's a very good point. While I refer to it as a standard because that's what I like, that is not a representation of reality. It's a good reminder for me. So thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. You got me on that one, sir.
Gotcha.
I appreciate it. All right, so let's go to the next slide so that I can stop referring to best practice as a standard.
All right.
This is another slide that I really like that really addresses address point placement methodologies. We can all accept and understand that there are so many different ways to skin a cat. From using a geocoding methodology to your road center line to place your points, to just doing a site location, parcel placement, are you placing points on structures, front door, property access? None of these are wrong, but there are some advantages and disadvantages to each of these methodologies. So let's talk through a couple of those real quick. So from a parcel placement, so just placing a point on the centroid of every parcel, some advantages are that this can be automated and consistent. You can make this really pretty. It looks great. It's very standard. It's very best practice-y. If you implement that solution in your locality, it can be spatially joined to corresponding parcels, making some of the enhanced features in a desktop environment really easy, but it may not identify the location of the specific structure. So if the intent is to show a point on a parcel and that point is assumed to be the location of the structure, in this instant, I would have to have something else to use to compare. I would need imagery to show me where the structure is located, right? I don't know if producing this and sending someone out in the field with it and saying, hey, the very center of that parcel is where the home is. How big is the parcel? Is it 100 acres? Can I legally access that parcel to get to the structure? So it also may not be placed well where there are multiple addresses exist on the same parcel because we're using one point to identify a location in the center of a parcel. So while it can be easy to set up, think through the process and how the information is going to be used and interpreted, and does it meet that requirement? And then our next example, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, one comment on this. I think you can see from the example, in your typical suburban neighborhood of residential single-family homes, it's a great way to kind of get good enough, right?
Absolutely.
Because it'll put you close enough that you can see the smoke. You know, the first responders can see the smoke. But maybe not on the structure. And the structures are numerous enough and close enough together that as long as you know the address number, you can get there, right? The first responders can get there. But in more dense urban areas, this is what's pointed out in that last disadvantage, where there's multiple structures on a given parcel. If you have 300 apartment units on this one parcel over here on on this bigger parcel, that one point in the middle of the parcel is pretty useless other than getting you to the area. But then you got to go figure out where among these 300 sub-addresses do I need to actually be. So this is a good, as you mentioned, it's easily automated, it's consistent, it's a starting point perhaps, but there's other good options to look at.
A prime example of being geo-okay in this is if you currently aren't maintaining address points, but you're being required to create some, this is a great starting point for creating a point layer using parcel information.
I'll jump in here and say that no one should have to do that in West Virginia. We have at least at a bare minimum data collected in the 2003 readdressing project statewide, which was a rooftop location at the time. Granted, most counties at this point have some form of updated address point, even if it is on a road center line.
Perfect. All right, and then our next methodology is placing a point on the center of a structure. You can automate this pending you have a polygon layer for your structures. You can automate that. You can also spatially join this to other parcels. It's a more accurate representation of identifying location and structure in space. So a ton of disadvantages to this. It also gives the viewer an actual idea, right? We're providing more information here. We've got our road, we have our structure boundary so we can see the outline of the structure. And then we can see the address point on the center of the structure, identifying this number goes here with this structure. While it states that there are none noted disadvantages, in this scenario that we're looking at on the frame, of course there's not. But what if these were duplexes? We would have stacked points on top of each other that could be duplicates. If these were apartment buildings, you could have 50 address points that are stacked on top of each other. So we can identify some unique examples of where doing a center of a structure can have a disadvantage, but think about how it's going to be used in reality and how it's going to be interpreted. I think that's where we have to go. This also may be easier from a management standpoint. If you're using imagery to compare address points or do some sort of analysis on new buildings that you may not have accounted for during a planning process, this could be great as well. I like this. I know there are some folks that prefer a front door methodology, but they're not real consistent with it. And that's something that has to be articulated across the spectrum if the point's representative of the front door, because the front door could be in the back of the house or on the side of the house or the front of the house, right? There are different planes that could be, which is going to put those points all over the place that also may not align with a driveway or a sidewalk if you're using imagery as a comparison. So think through, be very thoughtful when approaching a placement decision, but be consistent with it.
Well, and let me say too, Drew, that the thing that's from a NextGen 911 perspective, the address points that are the most important are the ones that clarify routing of 911 calls, where the geocoding of the road center line may be ambiguous, right? So those tend to occur around these boundaries, PSAP boundaries, emergency service boundaries, fire, law, EMS. And so your parcel placement, for instance, like the first slide showed, is probably good enough in 95% of your areas from a NextGen 911 perspective. It's also very easy to actually create, right? But in the case where we have those 300 apartment units over here, especially if you put a boundary here, or worse yet, a boundary that slices through that parcel, those address points are insufficient, right? They're not going to clarify the routing of the 911 call for that machine-to-machine interface. Instead, they're going to confuse the routing of that 911 call in all of the cases where 911 call is placed in this little corner that gets sliced off into another jurisdiction. On the structure itself helps that even better, but more sub-address parts help it even better. So if you have a pretty good address point data set at this level, you need to work on identifying the places where you need to get to this level. And then also identify the places where this level really isn't sufficient either, and we need to go to a sub-address level. That's kind of the way to approach address points for next-gen 911 call routing, is really to prioritize your resources and prioritize your needs. You need to figure out where routing would be clarified by a deeper level of precision. So we're going to talk about that next.
Absolutely. So accuracy versus precision, right? This is taking those point placement methodologies and actually identifying which is more accurate, which is more precise, which do you need. So this is accurate. The goal is to identify a unique location for every parcel in the center of the parcel. Sure, this will work, but does it address questions I may have, Jeff, related to where the structure is that I may send services to? And no, it doesn't. We can see that there are several parcels that have multiple structures. So really the goal is to be accurate and precise. So when we throw precision into the conversation, it's identifying that point as the structure in the parcel or multiple structures if they're inhabitable. Right, I'm going to assume that all of these are just one habitable structure. These are homes, these are farms. They're not apartment complexes or duplexes or industrial buildings or industrial complexes, right? So that's where you have the ability to make a decision and make the decision that fits best for you. But think back to what Jeff was saying about the purposes for NG911 and how that may help you make those decisions and how you want to manage the data. Yes, there are other courses that are out there that you can find about geocoding and addressing. Now let's what? Go ahead, Jeff.
Look at there. You made a comment that was a step ahead.
Yep, absolutely. Geocoding. Ranges actual versus potential or theoretical. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both of these methodologies. So in the top left, we have something that's more representative of actual road ranges, where it's 133 to 170. It corresponds to the numbers, the home addresses that we have on the road. It's also not something that's kind of a catch-all, 100 to 199, that might shrink everything to the center of the road when we automate that process. Right, so in the top left, actual, it's an easy way to create address point placement in an automated fashion, allows for quick mass address point creation. Some disadvantages though, is it can result in spatial locations far from where, wait, why are these feel wrong to me? The advantages and disadvantages here feel wrong.
Feel repeated, don't they?
They do feel repeated, but they also feel wrong.
Well,
all right, so
they should be flipped, right?
They should be.
Where you have those theoretical ranges or potential range, the advantage is that they're easier to maintain. If you have, I worked for the Greater Harris County 911 network that covered 2 counties, the most populous counties in Texas, and we had 250,000 road segments. You better believe that I was using potential or theoretical ranges because there was no way I could manage to keep up actual ranges without an army of analysts and technicians, right? So it's approachable, but again, will it get the responder to the place where they can see the smoke or where the person is outside the door waving their hands? It will. It'll do good enough, right? They know that they're going to 137, and they know that 137 may have geocoded to the middle of the road or, that first third of the road, but in fact, it's in the first 20%. That's close enough. But in a dense urban area, maybe it's not. So maybe I need to have, again, a hybrid approach It allows in the areas where it's good enough to do theoretical, and in the areas where it needs to be actual, use actual.
Yep. And we get to highlight my copy paste error when pulling content over to the new slide template. So apologize for that, guys. It catches me up, and I'm sure it catches you up too. That will get corrected before we send the slide deck out.
Yeah.
All right, so next, hey, Jeff, before we get into standards, you want to do a little 5-minute?
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, we'll be back with you. So it's 11:17. We'll come back at 11:22. I am going to All right, did you guys miss me? All right, so let's jump into standards here. So I told you guys that we would identify a couple of standards. The first one I want to point you guys to is the CLDXF, or the Civic Location Data Exchange Format. We're going to fly through this one pretty quick because it's actually incorporated in one that I want you to pay more attention to, which is the data model. But become familiar with what's in this standard because it relates to road centerline and address point parsing being identified in this standard. Parsing is something that was fairly new to me in the NG911 conversation, and we're still seeing that's new to a lot of people. So data that's not parsed correctly gets identified as an anomaly or a validation error in your data. And really what it's just saying is, go to the next slide for me, Jeff, is these street name elements, street type elements, all have to have their own attribute in your data attribute table, where we may mash everything together, the pre-modifier, the pre-directional, the pre-type separator, the name, post-directional, post-modifier. These are required elements, but we may have one field in our attribute table that identifies alternate north, Avenue A or whatever. So parsing is going to be big. These are 8 required types. You may not have something to put in there, but it will be in the data model. So when you see it in the model, I want you to know where it's coming from. It's coming from the CLDXF standard. The next one.
The great thing about CLDXF, before we move off of it,
Yeah, go ahead.
is that it provides these great illustrative examples, like help you understand what's a pre-modifier. Well, it's the alternate in alternate route B. What's a pre-type separator? It's the of the, right? In the of the. We're gonna make that one word, of the. but it really gives you a playbook. So if there ever becomes a question about how do I parse this road name out, it gives you really good examples and a good playbook.
Absolutely. That's a very good point, because some of these are very unique to your specific locality, or they may not be, like of the.
Yeah.
Right. Avenue of the Americas. Jeff, of the. Say what?
May not have any of those.
You may not. I tell you, in Mississippi, of those probably one word though. I can say that because I'm from Mississippi. And then the four address number elements that we see are the address number prefix, the address number itself, the address number suffix, which if you use half addressing, that half would be considered the suffix. And then optional, which is a milepost, maybe even given to a place or in addition to the address number. I haven't experienced the optional milepost option. I would imagine this could be used for.
Well, all of a sudden it gives you an opportunity to put those highway mileposts that you wanted in your address point data set. Maybe you had anyways, right? This makes it legit to NENA standards. It also is a great example of if you, and I know West Virginia would have a lot of hiking trails and bike trails and things like that, where if you can get signage up on those trails, the milepost field is going to be really helpful to your public safety.
Yeah,
your dispatchers, your responders. And so you might think about partnering with your nature conservancies, your trail managers, and things like that, and get them to put up signage, and you put the data in your, you reference the data in the correct location in your GIS data. All of a sudden, when that hiker, breaks their leg on that mountain trail, and they need a helicopter response, they've got a location that's way better than the trailhead, right? Oh, do I go to this trailhead or that trailhead? Because the firefighter or the rescue paramedic has, a 3-mile hike from this place or a 6-mile hike from that place. It makes a big difference for them to know exactly which milepost they're at.
Right, absolutely. And then we get into sub-addressing, which again could be a new element for you guys. Maybe you're maintaining a sub-addressing field as part of the address number. So like 1253A, that A would be identified as a building sub-address or an additional location information. Could be the floor, the unit, the room, or the seat. So you can get pretty granular on here. And while I think it's cool, I also want you to keep in mind that, sure, while you can get down to seat number in the auditorium, if they have plans to destroy the auditorium or reconfigure it in the next year, you have to redo your data to match what the new configuration is. So some of this is required, most of it's not. Building, if you have building information, put that in there. If you have additional location information, like the west wing, throw that in there. If the floor is a mezzanine level or 1, 2, 3, or 4, throw that in there. A unit or a suite number, put that in there. Room might be good for a high school or a preschool or maybe your work building. Seat, be cautious. I don't know that I've ever seen a data set that had seat in it.
Yeah.
All right.
Highly, you'd have to be able to trust the maintenance of that data in order to bring it in.
Absolutely. Because while you can do it, you also have to manage it. All right. Now we want to talk about the data model. And there's a great comment in here that, just a heads up, Esri's local government model is not NENA's standard for NG911. There are similar components to it, so you can manipulate your local government data model to include the required, the optional, and the conditional fields from the GIS data model, but they're not already going to be there. You're going to have to add them in.
Yeah, they
Which
won't
is
be
okay.
useful. They won't be able to be used in their solutions because they're not.
Right, absolutely. But I really want to encourage you guys to read through this document. I think it's about 108 pages, and there's some really good information in there that also looks at some of the CLDXF stuff. But it does require thoughtful interpretation. You must have mandatory fields have to be populated. Legacy fields are conditional but useful in the interim. So any legacy fields that you currently have in your data schema, continue using them, add the mandatory fields to support where you're going, even though the legacy fields may be removed at some point. Elements that are historically not tracked, like state and county, are going to be required. And it's amazing to think that we don't have a state attribute or a county or a city attribute in our data. And that really references back to, we're really familiar with managing data for our localities with not having to share it out much. So look through your data. Do you have a state column? Do you have a county or a city column or a community value? Community is actually a conditional or an optional. No, it's mandatory. Community is mandatory in the data model, so you will have one. And then be flexible. Mandatory is going to be the only field where you are required to have it populated. And then conditional and optional, that I think we show some examples. We actually don't show any examples in here, but as you get into it, be flexible with what data you provide for conditional and optional. If you already have it, provide it. If you do have it, provide it, but don't beat your head against the wall thinking that it's got to be there. Does that make sense? All right, now for the GIS folks, this is why we really get here. The data model identifies PSAP boundaries, road center lines, emergency service boundaries, address points, and provisioning boundaries as the required data layers for NG911. It also identifies the stuff on the right. So the source or the responsible authority for coordinating with local addressing authorities and GIS data providers for provisioning addressing data to the NG911 environment is the 911 authority. They're the responsible party. The purpose of our boundary data, specifically our PSAP and provisioning boundaries, is to provide each PSAP with that seamless, normalized, and highly accurate footprint identifying their jurisdiction, which is extremely important. Update. New data or data errors should be updated in the GIS within 3 business days. We spoke to that earlier. We repeat it again because you need to listen to it. If you want to learn more about that and what that actually means, let me know, because I actually have a presentation where I've done some digging into what that actually means and how you can take steps now to prepare for that. And then accuracy, each source entity is responsible for the accuracy, both spatial and data attribution for each data set, meaning we can't have any gaps or overlaps. We can't have any redundancies. We have to identify duplication. But while we can say that you can't have some of this stuff, you also have the ability to mark some of these anomalies as exceptions, like a misnumbered house or a house that would be on the wrong side of the road according to the validation. We get into that a little bit later, or we can dive deeper into that more if you guys have questions about what exceptions mean. All right, but first we want to talk about the address points. So again, it's a required data set. It is the most precise call and resource routing information that you will provide to 911. It is structure-based. It does require sub-addressing where necessary and can include non-addressed dispatchable locations. And with the image that we have, I want to say that there's also a highlight to consistency to the data. We spoke to it on the point placement methodologies so that you don't end up with this, right? We have a bunch of different points. We don't have labels turned on right now, so I don't know what these are. but I can assume that anything that sits on the center of a structure is an address number. But the stuff that sits on the curb, is that a fire hydrant? Is it a water valve? What other data do I have in my address point layer that may or may not need to be there? So that speaks to, I've worked with some localities who had fire hydrants in their address point layer. I was like, we had to think, did it really belong there? Or could it belong as its own separate layer? Well, if each fire hydrant has an address, keep it there, because it's an addressable location that is, or can be a non-addressed dispatchable location, like a pump house or something that's like a trailhead. So address points get really detailed in the document, but there's a reason why. I said a lot to say very little there, I feel like. But sub-addressing is something for most GIS professionals is going to be fairly new, and how you manage sub-addressing or even create sub-addressing to really eliminate duplicate address points. So the image that we have here is identifying apartment buildings that could be anywhere, college campus, could be different apartment complexes, but they're all using the same building address, 43 Delaware Avenue or 45 Delaware Avenue. That may be the mailing address to that location, but we don't have suite numbers. Or if we do have suite numbers, if we look down in our attribute table, we are tracking our suite or unit number as part of the address number. Well, if we think back to our provisioning rules for CLDXF, we know we need to separate that. That suite number, that unit number needs to be in its own field. That's a subname or subunit or subnumber value in our attribute table. Here, the way that we have it, because it's in our label field, it's okay. It's going to show that there's a duplicate. But think about colleges and universities. If you have a military installation that's in your locality or near your locality, shopping centers, malls, strip malls, apartments and condominiums, that's typically where you're going to see sub-addressing anomalies, or you fat-fingered something. So this becomes more and more difficult to manage after you identify it, because some of this stuff can change frequently, like in shopping centers and strip malls. As things come in and out, whereas apartment buildings, you may actually have to form a relationship with a property manager to accurately understand how sub-addressing works for that apartment complex. These are tough. These are going to be difficult. They're easy to identify, but require a lot of thought into how you're going to manage the data and display the data. Sub-addressing extremely important as you move forward. All right, and then our PSAP boundary. It's required. This is the boundary for our primary PSAP, and it's a footprint that has to align correctly with our neighbors. So when you're creating PSAP boundaries, don't create these in a silo. Make sure that you're working with your neighbors to validate the boundary lines between both of your PSAP boundaries. You need to eliminate gaps, eliminate overlaps, and eliminate duplicate polygons or slivers of polygons that could exist at the boundary or internal to the polygon, depending how it was created. So multi-part polygons should be removed as well. Now we're getting into more really of the GIS aspect of managing these data layers when we pull them in and they go through that validation process. The same with our provisioning boundary, which is probably, in my opinion, one of the more easier boundaries to create, because it's easy to look at a PSAP boundary and a provisioning boundary and say, all right, it's just a duplicate of my county boundary. Some cases, yes, most cases, no. The provisioning boundary is the exception to that rule because it's a geofence that's identifying the spatial, I'm losing a word here, extent of your, of the area that you are required to manage and provision your data. So that could be your county boundary unless you're responsible for managing GIS data that falls outside of your county boundary. Right, so the provisioning boundary defines the area of GIS data being provisioned to support NG911. This one's not going to change much. The PSAP boundary, once you establish it and you verified it and you validate it, is probably not going to change much. The next ones may require some thought into creation, and that's your emergency service boundaries. I know most of us have an ESN layer or an ESZ layer. It identifies the response areas for fire, police, and EMS all as one polygon or disparate polygons within that one layer. Well, for NG911, we need to split all of those out into their own individual layers: a fire layer, a police layer, and an EMS layer. And we can't have any gaps, overlaps, or duplicates between either of those layers. But within the layer, think of fireboxes, right? You may have multiple polygons within your fire ESB because you have multiple engines or multiple stations in your locality. Those can have gaps and overlaps within that one layer, but as you compare fire to police, you can't have any gaps or overlaps. I think I said that right. No, I said that wrong. Reverse that. Reverse that.
Chat box, yeah.
Reverse that.
When you have within each layer, right? So it's not one emergency service boundary layer. It's one emergency service boundary layer for fire. So no gaps, overlaps, duplicates in that layer.
In that layer.
One
Yep.
ESB layer for police. No gaps, overlaps, duplicates in that layer. So to answer your question, Mika, that's how you display it. And again, focus on these boundaries about where does the call get answered, primary, or transferred with the ESBs, right? So even if there's a mutual aid agreement, they're still going to be dispatched out of PSAP A, right? This PSAP dispatches them, even if they're dispatching from another agency, or they're transferring it to a different agency in order for them to dispatch their mutual aid response.
Absolutely. Thank you. You said that so much better than me.
You're welcome.
All right. Now you've heard us talk about no gaps and overlaps. That really feeds into validating your data. But before you jump in and just start validating your data, I really want you to spend some time and put some thought into this. Think about strategic planning and how you're going to plan this process out. Identifying who else is sitting at the table, identifying your existing data workflows, your data supply chain. And as you get into planning out how you're going to address anomalies that are identified within your data, you need to have some structure to it so that you don't inadvertently interject error. As an example, as you do data validations, you really want to address the MSAG and the MSAG to centerline comparison first. So any anomalies that are identified in your road centerline or your MSAG, make an effort to correct those first, because think about how address points are created using road center lines. If you were to correct an address point anomaly, but not address the anomaly on the road, you may create more error, right? Think about if you currently do not have boundaries, work through creating your boundaries. Work internally first to identify the extent of those boundaries, and then get together with your neighbors to make sure everything matches correctly. Perform a cross-jurisdictional data validation and identify any duplicates, any gaps, any overlaps between your boundary data. And then begin to normalize your data and work on your address point to alley comparison and ensuring road types are the same. You're using ST for street instead of STREET, or AV versus AVE, both in your alley, your MSAG, and your GIS. Right, so put some thought and some methodology to this, because if not, it's going to get overwhelming very quick. Because it's going to, as you start, it's going to be such a heavy load and a heavy lift of so much information that without this process in place, it could be very overwhelming for you and stifle you in some aspects. And then don't forget data maintenance. I don't think we talk about data maintenance enough when we talk about NG911 and validating our data for next gen 911, but it's not one and done. This is a cyclical process. It's very repetitive because our data is changing every day. We're touching our GIS data daily, and we're all human. It would be easy to fat finger an A or an F or a 1 and a 2. The validation aspect of my data is going to ensure that I catch that, and my maintenance workflows are going to ensure that as I address new subdivisions, new roads, any changes to my data, validation becomes a part of it so that we're maintaining that high level of accuracy over time, not once a month, once a quarter, or twice a year. And that's why I really want to highlight that 5 spot, that data maintenance again, because it speaks directly to the need to repeatedly validate your data. You're never going to be one and done. Data validation becomes a part of your data maintenance practice because you're not only supporting the tax assessor's office, the planning department, and public works, you're now as GIS professionals supporting 911, unless you already sit in 911, right? There's an anomaly there. But data maintenance and data validation should go hand in hand. But let's identify some common anomalies that are addressed in your data. First, I did want to provide this document resource for you because you've heard me talk about the 3 business day turnaround. It comes from this requirements document for NG911 data management. The document states that the turnaround time for the 911 authority, keep in mind the 911 authority is receiving the discrepancy report. To resolve a discrepancy report shall be 3 business days, right? And it applies to ECRF, LVF, LIS, and the SI. So each of those components in our next gen environment have the ability to produce a discrepancy report, right? So that if you miss something when you're pre-validating your data, which is identified on our next slide, as noted in this document, it is expected that 911 authorities will perform QA/QC processes listed like the ones listed above prior to provisioning the data into the core services environment, thus minimizing the errors and resolution timeframe for the provisioning process. Now, what that is saying is check for gaps and overlaps, duplicate attribution, address range issues on your center lines before you take that chunk of GIS data and provision it into the ESINet. Because if you're not doing the pre-validation process, can you imagine the number of anomalies that potentially will be identified and spit back out? So a county that I worked for, we went through this process. We did the pre-validation. It took us 2 years to get the data above that 98% accuracy before we could even think about provisioning it to the SI. 2 years to perform data quality checks and data remediation. That's massive. And my data was okay. And I know some of you are looking at this list and you may be grabbing a screen capture and saying, all right, I just got to look for invalid geometry, gaps, overlaps, duplication, make sure the mandatory fields are there. I'm good to go. No, that's an example of things to look for. It is not a list of everything to look for. And then we further talked through that document, issues that are related to ECRF and LVF that have a time constraint on it that require a QA/QC processes, and the turnaround time is still 3 business days. And then the next one I think is related to the SI, which has a different turnaround time. It's not necessarily GIS related for some of this stuff, but I provided additional information to show that they have recommendations for resolving issues in different time frames depending on where the discrepancy is coming from. The important one here is for GIS data. It's 3 business days. What does that actually mean? Is it enforceable? Is it possible? Maybe yes, maybe no. The important thing is to know that that exists and to start doing planning now on how you may address these types of anomalies once you're in that environment. Oh, my image didn't come up. Go to the next slide, Jeff, because I actually have, I bet there it is. All right, so one of the things that's really helpful in identifying anomalies within your data is running a fishbone analysis. This is something that we do as part of a validation run that we perform, but it really provides that very visualized component that quickly helps you identify issues that may exist in your data, because we're mapping the address point to the road center line and where it would fall. So you can see if the fishbones cross, or in our next slide, you can see if it's a spider web that you kind of have to demystify. Right here, this just visually looks like there's a problem, right? It can look overwhelming, especially if everything else is looking real pretty. It's all 90 degrees. But here, when you get into it, you can see that your address points are mapping to multiple road center lines because your address ranges are off. You have duplicate address ranges and duplicate road names on different segments of road. So that point is going to map to every segment of road that fits the value. It's probably not correct, but visually I can see that it's not correct, and it takes me kind of deducing what I see to identify that the solution is really easy to fix. I need to create more accurate road ranges to remediate this issue. So fishbones really helped me do that, or help me identify that. Address point duplication, as we identified earlier, is really common for a lot of folks, mostly as it relates to subaddressing. Most address point duplication errors we see, it's because there is a lack of subaddressing or a lack of really thoughtfully identified attribution for subaddressing. Fairly easy fix, can take some time to work through to make sure it's correct. Most of the time is subaddressing related. Additional types of anomalies are address points that are not reflected in the road center line that can occur due to misspelled street, an inconsistent directional value, an inconsistent street type, or a missing road. In the example we see here, it's an inconsistency on how we're identifying the road name, using second to ND versus second spelled out. There's not a consistency there. So number one, you don't get the fishbones. And number two, you don't get the fishbones. So you really see that it's an issue. And you can start running through a list of what possibly could be wrong. Consistency is a great place to start. But while we've identified some stuff that's very relative to address points and road center lines, topology is another big one that is going to be really hard to look at a data table and see. I can look at my attribute table and see that I have some duplicate address points. If I'm really good at doing some comparison, I can look at my attribute table and see that I have an inconsistency with the spelling of a road name. Some of this stuff I actually need to run a geo process for to see if I have overshoots or undershoots, if I have roads that are not split in the right place, if I have segments that are too short because they're slivers that I need to eliminate or merge, or I have self-intersecting road center lines that I need to split. So when we talk about data validation for GIS data for NG911, it really does extend way beyond just looking at tabular values. We actually dig into the spatial accuracy and the topology of the data, which is extremely important because this can affect how something is routed in that 911 call process.
Sorry, Drew, there's a good question in the chat. I'm gonna give a chat answer to that so we can.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Now, how your staff will really determine how you approach addressing validation issues or identifying resources for becoming NG911 compliant with your GIS data. Whether you have no GIS and you're completely vendor supported, so you outsource your GIS. If GIS is a secondary role for you, you're a planner that took a couple of classes in GIS in college, or you've slowly learned how to do GIS over time. as a primary role or as a secondary role, or you have an enterprise solution. We can acknowledge and accept that all of you guys wear so many different hats. It's going to create some effort to figure out how to build in this new requirement or this new task for you. By identifying how you're staffed, you may start identifying early that you need additional resources. You need another tech. You need to make sure that you're having conversations and understanding, excuse me, with your vendor who is providing you data management support. Are they aware of what's going on with NextGen? Are they aware of what your goals are for NextGen, and are they going to support you? And as an enterprise, are you all communicating together from data management to your data workflows to how you're distributing data? Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
To those, are we communicating about services, right?
Exactly, services. So staffing has a real big role in how successful you're going to be, because you may need additional resources to do this, or you may need to outsource some of this to help you, whether it's validation or management or remediation. So that's something you can think about now, and what it's going to take for you to be successful learning what you've learned. And then I wanted to throw in a little timeline in here for the 3-day discrepancy report resolution recommendation. So day 1 is when the discrepancy report is created, and day 3 is the reprovisioning of that data back into the SI. So if you're a one-person GIS shop, the new hat that you have is this timeline. When the 911 authority provides you a discrepancy report, you've got to quickly identify, is it data that you have access to? Do you own it? Are you pulling it from somewhere else? Who manages it? Is it something that you can remediate, or do you need additional information to solve the problem? And then you got to get it back to the 911 authority, or do you have direct access to put that data back into the SI? A lot of things going on here. It's nearly impossible to say that you can do it all in 3 days, right? But you need to know that this is documented as something that is right. This is a new timeline for us in GIS. We typically aren't limited to 2 or 3 days to make a data correction, but because of the significance of the data and supporting 911, it is important that we understand this and we start making changes to meet this as close as possible, whether it's identifying new resources. This discrepancy report now becomes the county administrator that walks in your office and asks you for a map, and you've got to stop doing everything, right? Because of the value and the impact the discrepancy has on something like 911. It's a little scary, but it's not as scary as you think once you start thinking through the process. If you have questions about it, give me a call. I'd love to talk to you about it. And then I kind of want to wrap up why GIS matters, right? Just in case you didn't get it from there. And it's because GIS is a big function of the centralized aspect of this diagram. GIS is being used for location validation function, for emergency call routing, for location identification. And it's only going to be as accurate or work as well as the accuracy of the data, which is why I'm really going to encourage you to put a lot of emphasis and focus, next slide for me, Jeff, on addressing anomalies within your data now, because that data is going into the spatial interface. Here's a key trick for you guys. The ESINet does not have to be established in the state for you to start working on data accuracy and data completeness. It doesn't. You don't want to wait, and this is personal opinion, you don't want to wait till the ESINet's in place before you start addressing anomalies in your data, because you're only pushing the timeline even further, right? So what can you do now to start addressing your data needs as it relates to quality and assurance? Who can you partner with to help you from that aspect? Or how can you plan it out in a phased approach so that it's not so expensive? And then I wanted to provide you the references again and highlight ones that we really target throughout the presentation to show you this is not stuff that we made up. We actually tried to dissect the standards and the requirements documents and stuff from NENA as it relates to NG911 to put the content into something that was a little more consumable for you. And if we've got any questions, we've answered a lot. I've also got my contact information here. And Jeff, if you want to throw yours into the chat so that people can reach out to you as well. I apologize for not throwing your stuff up here. This is not self-serving, I promise.
Yep, I'll be glad to put it in there.
Perfect. And feel free to reach out to Jeff. Feel free to reach out to myself. Call us, email us. Let's set up a time. Our goal is to make sure if you have questions that we get you an answer. If you want a copy of the slide deck, I think I can provide it out to Kevin, or just email me and I'll send it to you.
Yeah, we can make it available.
Okay, yeah, we want to make sure that you guys know that we're here to support you in whatever you need. Don't beat your head up against the wall. Just call us. We're happy to help.
And I don't know if you could tell it from our presentation, but we enjoy nerding out on these topics. So we love it when people bring us questions.
Absolutely.
Well, we greatly appreciate you guys devoting a half of your day to, or more. I know it takes time to present or to prepare these presentations. So thanks so much for coming in and giving a workshop. And I know we're technically going to be on lunch break starting at noon, but I know there are questions out there. If you guys have time to stick around, I'd really like to open it up for questions. If if not for a few minutes, or to have anyone else share their experience. I know I've invited a lot of people who've started the next gen 911 conversion. If any of you guys in West Virginia want to share your experience, that would be fantastic as well. So I'd really like to see if any of you guys are willing to unmute yourself and stick around for a little bit further of a discussion.
Absolutely. I'll also encourage you that if you want to see this again, you feel like you missed information, you want other people in your organization to see the presentation, call Jeff or I. We're happy to do this for as many times as we want to make sure the information gets out there. Or if you want to focus on a specific component that you saw, remediation, the 3 business day turnaround, having the conversation about getting going with next gen. We've got content already prepared to address a ton of different topics. This is just kind of a big one.
Yeah, no, well, speaking of seeing this presentation again, I believe we are actually recording this exact presentation. So this will be available on the conference website. But yeah, we'd love to possibly take you up on that in the future to maybe have a variant of this workshop and cover other specific topics that I know that there are questions out there in the addressing community that we get that maybe we could expand on.
Absolutely. Happy to do it.
Yeah, addressing is my other nerd topic. So
Thanks. Jeff actually has a really good addressing workshop that he does that often draws a ton of attention because we know how important and valuable getting that information out is.
all righty. Well, if there's not any specific questions, sure, appreciate the opportunities today.
Absolutely.
Good to meet everyone, and definitely reach out to us.
Yep, I'll echo Jeff there. Kevin, I really appreciate the opportunity to provide this workshop today for you guys. I sat in yesterday. There's a lot of great topics yesterday. I'll continue to hang out for the day. So if you see me in a room somewhere, shoot me a message. Would love to continue the conversation and figure out how we can continue to provide support for you guys. Great.
Well, again, Jeff, Drew, thank you so much for taking time to come present to us. Yeah, I'm sure we'll be in touch in the future.
Absolutely. If you're interested in the addressing workshop, drop Jeff or I an email or drop us a call so that we can schedule that out or figure that out for you guys.
Okay. Yeah. I know that, like I said, the AGP is always interested in trying to expand on its training opportunities. So we could absolutely work something out with AGP and getting something set up for you guys to make it available to the GIS community and the addressing community in general for West Virginia. So
Perfect. Sounds great. I love it.
well, thank you so much, everybody. As a conference note, please make sure you get a bite to eat and then come back and jump into a exhibitor session if you can. I know that they've put on some really good talks, and we'll do so over the next, I believe it's from 1 o'clock till 2 o'clock. And then we're going to wrap today with a GIS and surveying roundtable. So again, I really encourage you GIS users out there to jump into that for at least a few minutes and hear kind of what the surveyors are up to and where we can collaborate together. So again, thanks everybody for jumping in on the day 2 of our workshop. Thanks so much. Bye.